Hi, welcome to the second. Yeah, welcome to the second of the series of talk about Cuban independent publishing houses and publications. We will talk today with Pio E. Serrano, who was the founder of Verbum, Felipe Lázaro, director of Betania, Radamés Molina, who is the director publisher of Linkgua editorial. And here we have Lester Álvarez, who is a filmmaker and artist, and is also the director of La Maleza. And Francis Álvarez, who is Sánchez, who is the director of Deslinde, Editorial Deslinde. We will continue the talk in Spanish. So if you want to get all this content with a simultaneous translation, you can visit INSTAR page in Facebook and connect to the page and to listen and ask a question and whatever. So we will continue in Spanish now. Bueno, bienvenidos, Pío,
Welcome,
Felipe,
Pio,
Radamés, que están de este
Felipe,
lado,
Radamés,
y acá tenemos a Lester Álvarez
and here with
y
us
a
Lester
Francis
Álvarez
Sánchez.
and Francis Sánchez.
La charla de hoy continuaremos
Today's
conversando con
talk, we will continue
fundadores, directores de editoriales independientes
talking to
que
founders
arman
and editors of independent
ecosistema
publishing
de editoriales
houses who
independientes en
make up
Cuba.
a
Hoy
system
tenemos
of
el honor,
independent
yo
publishing in
diría,
Cuba.
de tener dos pioneros
Today, I would
de
say
esto que se
we are
llaman
honored
Felipe
to
y
have
Pío.
two
En el
pioneers
caso de
of
Pío,
this
se puede
scene,
rastrear hasta una
Felipe and Pio.
revista tan importante como Pensamiento
Pio's work
Crítico.
can be traced
Y
all the way
yo quisiera
back to an
comenzar
important journal,
conversando, Pío
Pensamiento
y Felipe, con
Crítico. And
ustedes,
I wanted first to
que
talk to the two of you.
quisiera ver cuáles fueron los
I would
referentes
like to know
que ustedes
what
tuvieron
were
y
your
el contexto en el
sources
que ustedes crearon estas
and what
editoriales
was
que
the
han sido
context
emblemáticas
in
a través
which
de
you
los años
created
y de las
these
que yo creo que
emblematic publishing
muestra que han
houses,
inspirado a mucho
which I
del
think
movimiento
have been an
independiente
inspiration for much
en
of
Cuba y
the
probablemente en otros
independent
lugares, sobre todo
publishing
ustedes que han
movement
estado
in Cuba
afincados en
and
España,
elsewhere.
han logrado hacer visible a
Especially
muchos de
the
los
two
autores
of you have
cubanos
been living in
de estos
Spain
primeros años y han
and you
hecho un
have
gran trabajo
visibilized some early Cuban
notable
authors and you
durante las
have
décadas.
maintained a remarkable work
Puede empezar
throughout
cualquiera de
the
ustedes.
decades.
Si quieres empezar, si empezamos contigo, Pío.
Maybe Pio, if you could
Sí, cómo no.
start.
En realidad,
Certainly.
yo comencé a
Actually,
trabajar en España
I
en el mundo
started
editorial
working in the
con
publishing
Carlos Alberto
world in
Montaner,
Spain
que había fundado
alongside
la
Carlos
editorial Mayor.
Alberto Montaner, who
Durante
had
varios
founded
años estuve
Mayor
como
Editorial.
director de producción
For
de esa
several
editorial
years, I was an
de
editorial
Mayor,
director at
hasta que
that
en
publishing
1990
house, and then in
fundé
I
la
founded
editorial Verbum.
Verbum.
Es el training que recibí junto a Montaner y la
I received
experiencia
my
que tuve
training by
durante
working
muchos
alongside
años con
Montaner,
el
and with my
gusto por el mundo de la edición fue lo que
experience
me ha llevado
alongside my passion for
a iniciar esta
publishing
aventura en
led me to
1990.
undertake this adventure in 1990.
¿Cuáles eran los referentes que ustedes
What were
tenían en
your
ese momento? Bueno,
sources
yo
or
recuerdo trabajar con Carlos
references at
Alberto
the
después en
time?
Playor contaba
So you
que
were
Playor puede
working
ser quizás
with
una de las
Carlos
primeras editoriales
Alberto in
que tuvo más
what
impacto en el
was
exilio. Yo no
perhaps one
recuerdo
of the
ninguna
first important publishing
anterior
houses in exile.
Playor.
I don't remember
No, no la hay.
a previous
No la hay.
Que yo
example.
sepa, que yo
No,
recuerde, no la hay.
to my
Sí.
memory, there is no
Playor
earlier
fue la
example.
primera
He
institución
inaugurated
internacional
Mayor and he
donde
ran
él fue el
it
propietario hasta 1990 y luego
until
fue cuando decidió
1990.
instalarse
And
definitivamente en
at
Estados
that point,
Unidos
he decided to
y
settle
como
definitively in the United
era el
States. And
administrador
my wife and
de
myself,
Playor,
my wife was a
pues
manager
entre los dos lo que decidimos
at the
fue
publishing
hacer
house.
nuestra
And so
propia
together we
edición
decided
Verbum
to set out on our
o
own
Verbum. Verbum, que por
adventure.
cierto, acoge el
By
nombre
the
de la
way,
revista Eduardo
Verbum
Resamalina. Es un poco de guiño,
is a hint to the name of the first
pues porque
journal
consideramos una
founded by
tradición
Jose Lezama Lima.
de la edición
And
libre
so
en
we
Cuba
regard
y
this as a hint
en
to a
nuestra
tradition of freedom in Cuba and,
Sí.
of course, also in Spain.
Felipe, en tu caso, cuéntanos un poco
Felipe,
cómo
could you tell us
surge Betania,
how
qué te inspiró,
Betania came
qué
about, what
editoriales
inspired
tomaste como
you, if
referencia,
there were other publishing
de los
projects
poetas que han
that
sido
you
presidentes,
referred to? poets more often than not, I mean, it's maybe hardest for poets to get their work published, right? So I think that maybe it is poets who work on this idea of having their own publishing house so that they can publish their work. Pio is also a poet.
Sí,
So what drove you
bueno, buenas tardes
to start the
a todos. Algunos los
project?
conozco como a Pío,
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
luego
I
Francis, no lo
know
conozco personalmente, pero es
some
Betania,
of you, like
Betania.
Pio and
Muy, muy,
Francis.
muy amistosamente de aquí. No, solo un inciso, y
I
es
would just
quisiera
make a
equiparar a Carlos Alberto
parenthesis.
Mayor,
I don't want to undermine
presidente anterior
Carlos
del Grupo de
Alberto's
Madrid,
work.
que es
There is
Ediciones Universal
another
en Mundo
precedent,
Salvat, y
Ediciones
él es la
Universal
dignidad,
in
el
Miami.
decano de los
I
editores
would
en
say
Cuba.
he is really the
Sí, sí,
dean
autoridad
of Cuban
editorial
publishers in
a nivel
exile.
mundial incluso grande, antes de Playor
This was
y de Maleza, que
an
fue Playor, y luego vino
important
después.
publishing
En mi
house
caso, yo
before
empecé
Playor.
en el mundo editorial como
In my own
coordinador
case, I
de un
started
grupo
out
español que se
as the
llamaba Clandestine,
international coordinator for a
y
Spanish
no
publishing
solamente se
house.
publicaban libros, sino también las
We
revistas que
published
salía La Burbuja,
books, but
donde
also a literary
muchos
journal,
cubanos, autores
which
cubanos
had
que estaban
many
prácticamente
Cuban
exiliados.
contributors,
Esa editorial
most of them in
duró 10
exile.
años
And that publishing
y al
house
final
lasted
cerró,
for a couple of
y yo me
years.
encontré con una
And when
cantidad
it
de
shut
manuscritos que no
down,
solo
I realized
me
that
quedaron,
I
sino
was
que
holding on to
me
many
seguían pidiendo.
manuscripts and I kept getting new
Pensaban
manuscripts
que seguía en Catobleta,
from
entonces
people who thought that I was still
empezamos a
working
crear
at
en
that publishing house. And that's when I had the idea
1987.
of
Yo obtuve la
establishing
beca Serpa
Betania
de parte de
in
Serpa, una beca Serpa,
1987.
para
By
publicar
chance, I received a
los
grant that year, and I
antecedentes de
used
Betania.
the fund
Y
from that
coincidí
grant
con
to publish
Gastón
our
Vaquero,
first
esta es la
books,
primera entrevista que yo le
like
hice
an
a
interview
Pío,
with Gaston
sí,
Baquero
y otros poemarios
and
que
other
fueron los
books
que
of
crearon
poetry.
para mí la bolita de nieve
And
que
this
empezó en
is
el
what sort of
87 y se
got the
expandió
snowball
en los
rolling
90,
in
etcétera,
87, and
etcétera,
it grew
para
bigger
contar
throughout the
hasta llegar a un fondo
1990s.
editorial de casi 800
And
títulos.
by now,
Y
our
novela,
catalog
novela
has
poesía.
almost 800 titles.
A mí me influyó
I
mucho
should
mi
say,
trabajo,
nonetheless,
pertenecer en
that
Catolepa y estar
in
en todo el
addition to
mundo,
my work in
en el
that
mundo de los
publishing
editores
house,
cubanos
I
centrado
was
en Madrid. Sí,
influenced
yo
by the
hice
publishing
el
world
trabajo,
um,
la
of
maestría
Cuban
de grandes
exiles
editores
in
como
Madrid, Spain.
quizá de modo artesanal el querido José Mario,
For example, our dear Jose Mario, whose project was almost handmade.
Ediciones El Puente en Madrid,
Ediciones El
La Gota
Puente
de La Habana en Madrid,
in
y luego La Gota de
Madrid,
Agua
and
en
then
Vieja,
La
sí,
Gota de
Álvarez,
Agua.
etcétera, etcétera.
There
Varios,
were several
y luego
projects,
vino Montaner con Playor,
and
vino
then
Pío con
we had
Verbum,
Montaner
luego
with
se siguió
Playor, then Pio with
con Deslinde,
Verbum.
etcétera, etcétera. Es que hubo un boom
So there was a whole
literario
cultural
en los años 80 en
literary
España. Mucha
boom
gente
in
iba
the
y venía, Sánchez hace
1980s
poco estuvo.
and 90s
Y eso
in
quizá influyó
Spain,
en mí
which
porque
has been understudied.
empezó
And
a
this
formarse
influenced me
quizás
quite a
casualmente
bit.
como editor, porque
Maybe I was
como yo siempre
fortunate
digo, soy poeta, editor,
because, as I
y eso
always
fue lo que
say,
me
I am
llevó
both a
a
poet and an
luego vino
editor,
Radamés
and this
Molina,
connected me
que ahora
to
mismo
younger
he entrevistado a
generations.
casi toda la nueva generación de
So
poetas
I've been fortunate enough to be able
venida del
to
norte, ¿no?
publish
De
all of the
Sánchez,
new
de Joao,
generation
de
of Cuban
Ariel, de
writers in
Carlos,
exile.
etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Y luego quizás a ver en los
And
años,
then maybe the
por allá del
fact
2010,
that already around
publicar la colección
2010
editorial
I began to
de los
found
ebooks
our
que se pueden adquirir
ebooks
gratuitamente en
collection,
nuestro blog
which can be acquired for free in our
documenta.com,
blog.
que fue una manera de
And this has been a way
romper con la censura
to
del castrismo.
break with
Nuestros
the
libros cuando se
censorship of
publicaban en
the
Cuba, nosotros los
castrist
mandábamos, los
regime.
regalábamos. En
We
Cuba
would
debe haber más de
send
500
our
libros
books
de
to
Betania
Cuba. We
vendidos ahora.
actually sent them for free.
No se
And
podían
there
vender
must
en ninguna
be
librería,
many
estaban
of
totalmente
them
prohibidos.
around in Cuba.
Y
They
ahora
couldn't be
publicamos,
sold in any
tenemos la ventaja que
bookstore.
primero
But now with ebooks,
rompemos la censura
we are
vergonzosa por
able to break with the
supuesto.
censorship or
Y
the
además
cultural
nos ahorramos todo
blockade,
el lío del
and we
dinero que eso del
also don't
correo
have
que
to
subió
go
una barbaridad.
cover shipping
Enviar un libro
costs, etc., which these
impreso
costs are greater and greater. To send a printed
Así que el libro
book
que había que publicar en
nowadays
muy
somewhere
poco,
else, it's
y
too
eso hizo
expensive.
la- las dos grandes
So these are
piedritas
the two
que ha puesto
pebbles
Betania
planted by Betania
en la cultura cubana del exilio.
in the Cuban
Dani, tú has
culture
introducido un
of
tema
exile.
sí, has introducido un tema que voy a
You've
poner en hold
mentioned
para
a
después, porque
topic that
hace
I
poco
am
escuché
going
las
to
editoriales,
hold on to
retomarlo
so that we
y
can maybe discuss it
conversar
later.
también un poco sobre eso. Y es el hecho,
Namely,
o sea,
The anecdote that you told us, you're talking about sending books for free to Cuba, and in a sense, much of your work has followed this principle. You've sent many books. I became aware of your work when I was in Cuba because people were passing the books around, and this understanding of the publishing house as a company that needs to make a profit or to sustain itself, but is also a cultural operation. But we'll talk about this again later because I want to hear from Radamés about the beginnings of his project Linkgua. What was the context and what motivated you to create it? Well, I should start by saying that I was aware of your publishing houses when I was in Cuba. These were books that were being published abroad by Cuban publishers, and this was an inspiration because you could perceive a degree of expressive freedom uh, and a kind of a business-like activity that does not exist in our country. I didn't meet you personally, but there was always a resonance with what you were doing. Myself, I arrived in Spain in 1993, and I had the chance to work in Paidós, the publishing house in Barcelona, and this is where received my training as an editor. At that time, postmodern philosophy was in vogue, and I was a compulsive reader of the works of Deleuze, Guattari, etc. And all of a sudden, I was editing books by Jacques Derrida in Barcelona for Paidós, and this made me feel extremely proud. So it was an incredible experience for me. And Paidós was eventually bought by the Planeta Group, which had a much more aggressive commercial business model. We could already see in advance that this would alter my activity as an editor. So this is when I decided to found Linkgua, my own publishing house. My family background was somewhat unique because my father was a geologist and very engaged in technical matters, so I was aware of software and other such issues through him. And the name of the publishing house, Linkgua, refers to this attempt to connect language work with technology. Of course, there were no ebooks at the time, but I was already connected with the software development and artificial intelligence software development to create connections so that it would not just be about having a book, but about connecting the book to the cultural system within which it is embedded. The possibility of reading a book transversally, not as a form of misreading, but as the possibility of comparing different things. And this has been part of the core of what I'm interested in doing as a publisher, which is the development of technologies that run in parallel to publication proper. For example, there is a project that I've had a pretty hard time getting through. The idea is to create tools that allow for a kind of a critical edition that is informed by these technological new paradigms. I've made a good way in that direction of creating tools that allow you to use metadata and AI to create multimedia links in connection to a text. So later on, you will share your screen and show us a little bit of this tool that you're developing that we will probably all find extremely interesting. And that might be useful also in academic contexts. Okay, maybe we can continue with Francis Sánchez. We know each other for about 20 years, and you and Diana, you're a couple, but also independently, you have your joint project and independent projects. So tell us a little bit about how this project emerged. You started out in Cuba, you already had some experience, the both of you. Then you as a couple came up with the idea. And yes, Jose, thank you. I want to thank you and Tanya and the and INSTAR for the chance to be here. I mean, sort of representing this broad spectrum of independent Cuban publishing in exile. There are many landmarks in the history of this movement. I think we've known each other in connection to these different developments when we founded the first independent Catholic journals in Cuba. You used to work in one of them in Pinar del Rio. This was my first publishing project was one of these journals, and even back then we were intellectuals in search of freedom within a totalitarian system. So we tried to take advantage of every small opportunity, but we would never have conceived founding a publishing house. It was impossible, but we did keep pushing forward certain projects. And this is how in 2005 we created our first publishing project in Cuba. At the time, there were special issues of a journal. So it was always a publication project that was connected to other cultural events that were taking place, driven by the need to confront a totalitarian state that seeks to erase us as individuals, to create our own ecosystem, to create our own structure. Who are we? Why are we getting together? What do we care about? What do we share? What do we publish? And how? And a publishing project, a magazine, a meeting space for conversation, this is the kind of thing that attracts us and allows us to obtain a degree of independence. And so around 2018, my partner and I both had to go into exile. And in these kind of special circumstances, you try to be own up to be at the height of the circumstances. So we didn't want to stop working on our projects. We also wanted to take the next step. And so maybe now in exile, we would be able to do things that we couldn't have done before. After struggling so hard under the yoke of totalitarianism, we once you are out of there and you have a sense of what freedom of expression and free enterprise entail, sometimes at the beginning you don't really know what to do because there are so many possibilities. So we started to feel very enthusiastic. I can attest to the fact that we receive very generous assistance from many people. Even when we were in Cuba, We were aware of the precious work of publishing houses like Verbum and Betania. This was a way for us not just to connect to what was being written abroad, but also to be aware of the history of Cuba, because we could only have access to the works of Gaston Baquero through Betania's publications. And when we left the island, he was one of the first people that we contacted. We were already in touch. And Felipe was extremely generous. He gave us advice, suggestions about how to go about the work. He caught us up to date with extreme generosity, and this allowed us to overcome many obstacles. So we are very grateful to him and Luis Rafael. Luis Rafael, who is running Verbum now, was also extremely generous. The people that we came across were not competitive or trying to prevent us blocking access to things. And so our work is also the result of this spirit of survival and obstinacy that is characteristic of Cuban exiles. And this has allowed us to create a community that we do feel proud of as we try to survive in exile. And so, of course, we decided to have an independent project, and of course, the issue of profitability comes about and is connected to the notion of independence. Right, not of course, yeah, we don't want to fall under the paradigm imposed by socialism where the intellectual is begging and always has to be thankful to the state because they are sustained by the state. They can only live and exist thanks to the state. And an intellectual who thinks that what they make yields no profit and they need to depend on the state. So I think that this effort to have a profitable enterprise was also meaningful to us. We wanted to have an independent project, but we wanted it to work as a company. And this is also something that we have been interested in already in Cuba. We wanted to function on the side of the paternalistic state and to go beyond state paternalism. And we are as capable as others. And we just want the same degree of opportunity as any regular citizen. So we don't want, since there is no Ministry of Culture in exile, fortunately, we don't want to be asking for subventions because Cuban intellectuals, we have been trained to think that our existence is possible only because there is a Ministry of Culture that at the same time sets certain limits. So we wanted to suppress that. So Deslinde is a project that wanted to be not just a Cuban publishing house, because this is another paradigm that we feel has been imposed on us. This idea that if you're Cuban, this it's a kind of like an emotional kidnapping. Cuban people, wherever they go, are kidnapped, and it's as if they had no right to be citizens of the world. So in Deslinde, even in the name of the publishing house, which means setting yourself aside, so we wanted to find a vehicle for getting rid of these complexes about identity. This is the first book we published, a book of poems by a Cuban woman poet. She allowed us to publish this work as our first catalog entry. We have also published other authors, not only Cuban authors. This is an anthology of poetry by a Venezuelan poet whose work is hardly known in Latin America. We have also co-published all of her works and several others through a foundation. I am I was happy to hear you thank the great publishers in exile, the pioneers, because I think something extremely interesting and moving about intellectuals in exile is that people have always been very welcoming to newcomers and allowed them to have a comfortable arrival and to get their projects going in the free world. And I think it's very meaningful that your first book was a book by Juana Rosa Pira, who was a poet in exile. Yeah, what was the name of the poem who received the Independent Literature Award? He and Juana Rosa, they corresponded.
Ángel Cuadro.
Angel Cuadra, I think, was his name. And in the correspondence, you see that he was writing for from prison, and she was looking for ways to publish his work in exile. Let's continue now with La Maleza. It's a unique project. A while ago, you were interviewed by Reinaldo Cubar for 14 y medio, and you said interesting things. You were saying that you're looking for works to be rescued from forgetting. La Maleza is halfway between art, sculpture, sculptural objects, literature as a possibility, the potential library, perhaps the unexistent library. It's a kind of a work in progress, and I would like you to tell us about your project. It's maybe the youngest of the projects. Here, I really like that interview because at first you're kind of talking about your desires, uh, but eventually you bring it about as a form of art, and it's a reality. At that point, you had one book, and now you have many more. So tell us a bit about the project, how it got started, how did you publish the first books? Tell us all about it because I think that it's a very unique and very interesting project. Thank you, Joaquin, Instar, and Tania, for inviting me. I feel truly honored to be part of this panel surrounded by writers. Myself, I'm a visual artist, but literature has always been even more important for me than the visual arts, not just for La Maleza, but in general, most of my works are usually referring to literature. La Maleza is a project that I created in 2015, and I will mention two particular reasons behind it. I have a friend who's an artist. His name is Dachel Hernandez. He is gay, and I mention it because this is the reason why he was excluded and marginalized in Cuba. He is an open opponent of Cuba's Communist Party, and Achel and I were talking, around 2015, so 7 years ago. I was talking with him, and at that point, he had been writing a diary for 20 years. He also writes poetry, and I remember he said to me, my work will never be published in Cuba, right? And I felt this as a kind of a blow. I said, it's so hard that you are aware, being such a young person, you're aware that your work will never reach a public space in your country. And so this touched me deeply. And then I have a friend called Etienne Martinez, who at the time was teaching physics in Havana University. He's an amazing writer. He writes experimental poetry. And Etienne, unlike Dachel, he was a bit more enthusiastic about the possibility of having his work published. So now and then he would be sending his books to literary contests in Cuba. Maybe I should explain for people who are not from Cuba. In Cuba, for your work to be published, you first have to win a literary contest, and part of the prize is the publication of your book. And this is one of the many strategies that the system has to exert censorship, because, of course, uncomfortable books never win any such prize. So Etienne was sending his books to these contests. Usually, they would require 3 to 5 printed copies, and when they were rejected, he would give the manuscripts to me. So at some point I had 3 of his books. I had read them, and in this atmosphere, I started to think about a work of art, an artwork that could somehow be a vehicle to visibilize this literary production that was being censored. It existed on its own right, but there was no space for it to be published. And this is how La Maleza came about. First, it was exhibited as in the form of sculptures, wooden sculptures of books made with recycled wood that I picked up from the trash. I would pick it up from the trash. I would sculpt a book and I would engrave the title of a work of literature that existed but that was unpublished. Right, this work, I mean, when I use this particular title, the title wasn't published yet. Fortunately, now it does exist as a column in Hypermedia. The authors, Catherine, the two authors share their experience of living together as a female couple, same-sex couple, with constant surveillance from the state police. She's an artist and she illustrates those texts. As you said, the project is alive and continues to grow. In 2015, I exhibited only 5 works. Here in Kassel, in the Peña del Júcara exhibition, we're showing a selection of 25 works. Right now, La Maleza, the catalog is of 65 titles in these object books. The object, as such, was in a sense a way of reproducing the inaccessibility of the content. Right, it exists only as a possibility, but it's closed off. But then the project remains alive and it honors its title, La Maleza, which means the thicket, the weeds. And a few years later, I was invited to participate in the Contemporary Art Salon. I took advantage of the fact that artists in Cuba enjoy a bit more flexibility. As Tanya mentioned a couple of years ago, literature is much more surveilled in Cuba. The government sort of has a keener eye for literature. Artists are also censored, but you can get a bit more done. And it took advantage of the fact that this salon has press coverage. And at that point, I published the novel Trenes van y trenes vienen, which at the time had been shelved for 10 years. I was the third person to read it. The manuscript was forgotten in a drawer for 10 years, and I published it as part of the art project. And later we continued to print some books on paper. Roman Gutierrez, his second novel, and a book of poems by Marian Fernandez with a prologue by Marta Luisa Hernandez Cadenas. I would like to mention that our books uh, have a graphic design by Julian Gold. He's been my partner in crime from the beginning of the project. So all of our printed books have his design. Yeah. So there is a kind of like a symbolic connection between the artwork made on wood and which cannot be read and the actual book which can actually be read. I saw that Catherine's book, Uranio Enriquecido, you were about to publish it, but then it was published somewhere else. Is this something that happens often? Since you finance the project yourself, sometimes using grants that you receive. How do you function since you don't have the typical mechanisms of a publishing house? It's part of your work. Yes, it's happened because understood as an artwork, it has three editions. This is a more recent edition that I made with material that I have found, wood that I have found here in Spain, where I am living currently. And I had two options. Either I imitate the original object as I made it in Cuba. It's usually much more mimetic with the book because it's old wood. I used to live in old Havana, and there you often find pieces of doors or windows in the trash. Whereas here I'm using this kind of like standard industrially produced wood. So I wondered, should I also go to the trash here in Spain? And I decided to do it. So when I have to make a new edition of a work, of course I now need to leave out some of the books that I first made when they were unpublished, but which have now been published. And of course, my hope would be that they all be published. I wanted to continue. I wanted to thank Felipe for his remark. He noted that maybe Universal is the most successful publishing house, but we forget the important role played by Juan Manuel Salvat, who is maybe the dean of the publishing activities in exile. Felipe, you are right to bring him up because we should acknowledge his work. Of course, Salvat by now has used to have their own bookstore in Miami. I think Salvat is an important point of reference for the next question. How does a publisher relate their intellectual concerns and their business concerns? I would say that they mutually need each other, but how do you balance the roles of a businessman and an intellectual? How can you create a healthy and productive balance between the two? Again, maybe we could start with those who are not here in Castle. Maybe you, Felipe?
Bueno, yo creo que en realidad el ideal sería una
Well,
mezcla
the ideal would
de un
be
sentido
a
cultural y un
mixture,
sentido comercial
a
o
bit of
económico.
culture and a bit of
Si la
business.
realidad comercial o económica, sin esa base
If
sería
you don't
imposible
have
desarrollar nada. Ahora,
some
siempre hay que
profit,
tener
you
en
couldn't get
cuenta
anything
la
done,
cuestión
but
cultural, la cuestión quizás
you
no tan
always
comercial, pero
need to
pero muy
consider
importante en el desarrollo de
that
este tipo de empresas
I, for instance, I think that for me, Betania is more a cultural project than a business project. That has been my premise, and I might be wrong, but after 35 years of publishing, I still do it all in Betania. I direct it, I edit, I'm the secretary, I deliver copies to the mail, I go to the printers. I've been doing that for 35 years, and it's a rewarding work because um, it is reflected in the books that you put out, the authors whom you publish. When you see authors that they started out publishing their first book with us, and then we see that the books are being published in new editions in more better known publishing houses. So it's rewarding. I think it's more rewarding from the point of view of culture than from the point of view of business. What do you think, Pio?
Nosotros, Aurora y yo tuvimos la
Well,
experiencia
Aurora and I,
inicial en Playor, éramos
when we
conscientes
started out at
de que
Playor, we were aware
teníamos que conciliar la
of the need
vocación
to
editorial, el
reconcile
compromiso con la
our
literatura cubana
commitment as
y
editors to Cuban
el
literature
proyecto de desarrollar
and the
una
project
editorial.
of
En ese
developing
sentido,
a publishing
considerábamos que éramos
house.
una
So
editorial cubana en España
that's
o
why
una
we
editorial
understood
española en un
ourselves
gran fondo
as a
cubano.
Cuban
Y en ese
publishing
sentido,
house in Spain or a
aceptamos
Spanish
al mismo
publishing
tiempo que un
house
amplio
with a
catálogo de
Cuban
autores
catalog.
cubanos de dentro y de fuera
So
de
this is
Cuba,
why
con
we
un amplio
publish work
catálogo
by
también
Cuban
de
authors
autores
within the island and outside the
autores
island,
latinoamericanos,
but also many
del mundo de
non-Cuban
la academia.
authors
Tuvimos muy
from
buenas
Latin America
relaciones,
and
incluso hasta el día de
academic
hoy hay un
authors.
vínculo con la academia
We still
norteamericana,
have
nos
very
permite
good
tener
connections to academia in the United
un
States,
movimiento constante
and this
de
allows
publicaciones
us to
editoriales.
have a
También
constant uh,
fuimos conscientes de que
stream
tenía que ser un
of
proyecto
academic publications.
autosuficiente,
We also
tenía que ser un
knew that
proyecto
the
lucrativo,
project had to
porque
sustain itself, that we needed to
teníamos
make
una
a
familia que
profit
mantener,
because we
teníamos
have
que
a
existir,
family to
teníamos una
maintain,
vida por delante
and we have a whole
que
life
tenía que
ahead.
darle sentido
So
en su más
we
amplio aspecto. Y sí,
need
sí,
to,
es laborioso, extraordinariamente
of
laborioso
course,
poder
it takes
mantener
a lot
ese
of work
equilibrio entre la
to
vocación
maintain a
editorial de
balance
publicar libros,
between
sacar autores, tener
your
sus
vocation
contactos,
as an
pero al mismo
editor wanting
tiempo,
to publish
cubanos sobre
certain
todo estoy
books,
hablando, y al
especially
mismo tiempo
Cuban
mantener un
authors,
servicio a la
but
sociedad de
also you
España
want
con
to provide a
distintivos que nos
service
identificaban
to
también, no
Spanish
solamente la
society
editorial
because
española,
we're in
con
Spain and we
un gran
identify
fondo
as a Spanish
de
publishing
autores
house.
cubanos. O somos también una editorial cubana que ejerce sus funciones editoriales en España y trabaja para un mercado no
So we
solamente
work
español.
for a
Tenemos
market, not just a
felizmente
market in Spain.
distribuidores en prácticamente toda
Luckily, we
América
have
Latina
distribution
y
in
con propios
most of
distribuidores.
Latin America
Y,
and the United States.
y en la estrategia para hacer sostenible
And so we
económicamente la
needed to have a
editorial
strategy for
y vinculándolo al nombre
profitability.
de Verbum, al nombre de la editorial, nosotros creamos una colección
We
de
created
textos
a
en español para extranjeros y de
collection of
textos
texts in
auxiliares
Spanish for
para
foreigners and of
el conocimiento de la escritura en español.
texts that
Y
could
quiero
allow
asegurar
people
que
to
esas colecciones
educate themselves in
no
writing in
literarias, sino de
Spanish. So these
carácter
are
pragmático y en el uso de
pragmatic,
la lengua, de
useful
verbo, que significa
publications,
también de
and it
lengua
has to
y
do
de
with the
libros
name of our
traducidos al
publishing
español, de
house,
libros
Verbum,
traducidos al
which
español para
means
extranjeros,
the word,
nos permitieron
speech.
progresivamente tener una
These
independencia
texts allowed us gradually
económica
to
que nos permitía
become
ayudarnos a
financially
publicar aquellos
independent,
libros
and
que,
this allowed us to
que
publish
requerían
other books
estar,
that we
estar
felt
presentes
needed
y
to be
que no
published
fuera una carga
and
para los autores.
which might not be profitable.
Y esa independencia, esa autonomía
So,
creada
this
con
degree of independence
conexiones
and autonomy,
paralelas, unidas
which we
también
have
al
created
mundo de la ficción, de la poesía, de
by
la
creating
filosofía,
parallel
sobre el arte,
connections to the
también
worlds of fiction,
fueron
philosophy,
muy beneficiosas para la
were very
economía de Verbum,
beneficial
como lo está
to
haciendo
our
ahora. Se
company's
ha aludido
economy.
a Luis Rafael Hernández. Luis Rafael
You
Hernández fue el
mentioned
actual
Luis,
director
Luis
de
Rafael
Verbum.
Hernandez, who is
Yo me jubilé en
the
1982,
Verbum's
como
current
profesor de escuela
director,
preceptiva
because I
hace 20
retired
años,
in
trabajaba por allá
2012.
afuera llegué a conciliar un convenio
And when I
con Rafael,
retired,
de manera que
I
él
reached an
debió
agreement with
asegurar que
Rafael
esta
because
página
I
Verbum
wanted to make
seguiría
sure
existiendo
that
y en los
Verbum
mejores
would
manos
continue
posibles,
to
que era
exist
la
and
de
it
un
would
Rafael
be
con
run
una
by the most able
capacidad
person,
extraordinaria y con una capacidad de
and
trabajo
that's
que
him.
realmente, bueno, ha puesto la editorial en,
Sí, y ha continuado tu trabajo
He's
continúa
aún
con
continued
un
your
siendo
trabajo
work.
extraordinario, más de 2000
Yeah,
títulos,
it's
títulos
extraordinary.
cubanos, es
We by
prácticamente
now
uno de
have
los
published
exámenes
over
autores
2,000
que han
titles of
presentado los
Cuban
grandes autores
authors
de la
starting in the
Segunda Guerra
19th
Púnica, podemos
century,
decir.
all of the
A
great
lo largo,
Cuban
por ejemplo,
authors.
de los origenistas tenemos prácticamente publicados
We've
todos los
published
origenistas.
the work
Ahora
of
mismo
most
acabamos de
authors from
publicar
the
una edición
Orígenes
de
journal
Paradiso.
group. We've just
No es una
published
novedad,
a
pero
new
lo que
edition of
consiste
Paradiso
que
by José Lezama Lima.
el
Of course,
editor
the
de la
book
obra, José
exists in print,
Plasariol,
but
ah,
it was edited this
ha
time.
concebido que Paradiso en realidad es la primera parte de una gran novela que se llama Paradiso y que incluía lo que venía a ser lo que se publica como segunda parte, como libro autónomo, pero que no lo es,
o
y
piano licario.
o piano licario. Entonces, esa edición está construida y justificada como, lo que llama Plasariol el paraíso completo. Es interesante, es una propuesta
Sí.
y ha tenido muy buena respuesta en el mundo de la academia. Es decir, bueno, decía yo que de la grupo de la generación de orígenes prácticamente están representados con diversos títulos, todos los autores de esa generación, y luego, por supuesto, la generación del 50. Es decir, que el catálogo nuestro, que tiene cerca de 1000 títulos de autores cubanos, yo creo que en ese sentido cumple un proyecto. Luego también es cierto lo que se decía, que desde Verbum también se ha constituido no una plataforma, sino que el Verbum ha sido una
So
especie
Verbum has also
de
become a kind
consulado
of
de Cuba en el
platform,
extranjero. Por
almost
Verbum, sí, por Verbum han pasado
diplomatic
desde los años
representative of
90,
Cuba in exile
han pasado un
since
gran
the
número de cubanos, unos
1990s.
que venían de Cuba y
Many Cubans
pasaban
have
como, bueno,
gone
a ver qué cosa
through
es esto, otros que
Verbum. They
venían y se
would come
quedaban,
from
otros
Cuba
que
and
necesitaban
try and see what
una
we were
idea,
doing. Others were here to
cómo echar
stay.
a andar, sobre
They
todo en el
needed
mundo de la
some
editorial,
help
¿no? Como pasó con César Leante, o como pasó
to
con Fabio Murrieta,
find
o
their
como
way
se
around the publishing world.
y otros casos. En los más recientes, como se ha mencionado, Luis Rafael, como Felipe. Yo creo que me gustaría hacer aquí
I
un
think here
breve
I would
comentario sobre
like
Felipe, porque siempre lo he
to
considerado como una especie de imán.
talk about
Felipe
Felipe's
es un
work.
imán
I
que
think that
atrae
Felipe is kind of
a los
a
cubanos
magnet.
que pasan por aquí y
He
efectivamente
attracts
soy
Cubans
consciente y
who
testigo de
go
esa
through
generosidad
here,
de la que se ha hablado.
and I
Felipe
am
es
I have
un
seen how
trabajador
generous
editorial y de una
he can
solidaridad
be.
extraordinaria y
Is
por eso es querido y tan
This is why so many
apreciado
people
en lo que
love
es
him
el archipiélago este
in this
del mundo editorial cubano.
archipelago
Indefectiblemente,
of
tanto
the
Felipe como
Cuban
la
publishing
gran
world.
cantidad de ellos, que
He
al
has
ser
rescued
publicados en
many
España
important
alcanzaron
writers,
una dimensión
and when they are published in Spain,
editorial
Internacional, claro.
y
they,
de
they
prestigio
reach an audience
que favorecía la
and
carrera de estos autores.
they have access to a degree of
Extraordinaria la labor de
prestige.
Felipe,
This has
realmente
greatly
merecida.
favored their
Sí,
career.
y hay que reconocer también que
And we
en el
should
momento en que
also
ustedes
acknowledge
crearon sus
that
editoriales, básicamente lo que
when each
legitimaba
of
al
you
mundo
created
editorial
your
cubano,
publishing
lo que legitimaba a un
houses,
escritor, era
a
básicamente
Cuban
publicar en
writer
editoriales
was
cubanas oficiales.
legitimated by
Porque en otra
publishing
como que no tenía
in
validez ninguna. O sea, tú
Cuban
publicabas una editorial que
official
no
publishing
fuera la
houses.
editorial Letras
Otherwise,
Cubanas o lo que fuera, y era
it
como que,
didn't mean
a no ser que
anything.
fuera una
If you
editorial
didn't publish your
internacional
book in
grande,
Letras
era como que
Cubanas,
no,
unless it was
no
a
era
large
publicado.
international
Pero ya
publishing house,
Verbum,
it's
Betania
as
empezaron a
if it
verse
had no meaning
como
at all.
paralelas a estas
But at
ediciones, y
this
a partir
point,
de hoy, o sea,
Verbum
ya en
and
el momento,
Betania
en estos años,
are
la mayoría de los
parallel to
autores
Cuban
publican en editoriales
official
independientes, y
publishers,
estas editoriales
and
independientes
by now,
legitiman al autor
at this point,
tanto
most authors
como
publish
cualquier
in
editorial
independent
estatal. Pero en
publication
estos
houses
años no
like
es.
your own, and
Cuando ustedes
this
empezaron,
makes it work as
básicamente
legitimate as
la
any
legitimación
official
del autor
publishing
pasaba
house.
por estas editoriales que
But
tenían
when
algún
you
tipo
started
de
out,
estructura estatal. Si no,
the
parecía que era
only
algún
option
vanity
for
edition,
an
que tú
author
te
to
habías
be
publicado tu libro
legitimized
o lo que fuera y nadie lo
was through
consideraba.
the
Y yo
official
creo que
publishing
eso a lo
houses.
largo de los años, por
Otherwise,
supuesto,
if
con
you
un trabajo
published
sostenido,
outside
con
of
unas
that, it
colecciones
would seem to be
formidables,
like a vanity
se ha ido
project.
constituyendo en una
At this
fuente
point,
también que ha legitimado a los autores.
you have
Y
created
sabemos
a
con quién lo
space
pasa,
for
como tú, como
legitimacy.
decía Lester,
for many authors. As Lester was saying, we know that to be a published author in Cuba, you need to win a contest. And how many authors there are who do not win any such contest because it's a slow process. Occasionally, maybe some authors are not interested in following that path. They would to follow an independent and personal path. And this is all due to the work of independent publishers
No,
for
tienes
several years now.
toda la razón. Era necesario abrir un
You're
espacio
completely right.
que,
We needed to
fuese un
open up a
referente
space
importante para los autores que
that
querían
could
publicar, más
function
allá,
as
por
a
supuesto, de lo
source
que
of
diga la
reference
aduana,
for
sino
authors who wanted to
a capricho del
publish
Estado. Y en ese sentido, sellos como
beyond the
Colibrí,
whims of the Cuban
de
state.
Víctor Batista, o
There are publishing houses like
Betania
Colibri, for
y
example,
Verbum, crearon un
and
espacio que
Betania
venía a
and
llenar esto.
Verbum.
En el caso de
We
Verbum,
created a
que
space that
como le
filled
digo,
that void.
prácticamente la mitad del catálogo nuestro estaba compuesto
As
por
I
autores
said,
cubanos. Sin embargo, creamos también, para
about
dar una
half
mayor
of
amplitud
Verbum's
y de universalidad
catalog
a la editorial, colecciones especiales,
is
colecciones
Cuban
como
authors, but
la
we also
colección de
create
libros de
special
Asia,
collections.
colección de libros
For example, we have a
la
series
literatura
of
coreana, por ejemplo, ¿no? Que fue una
Korean
sorpresa, nadie
literature.
sabía, muy
It
poca
was a
gente sabía
surprise.
dónde estaba Corea y mucho
Very
menos que había
few
una
people
cultura
knew
de
where
3000
Korea
años,
was,
pero bueno, tenemos
and much
publicaciones
less
en
that there was
libros de
3,000
autores
years of
coreanos,
Korean
pero bueno,
literature.
y la biblioteca hispanoafricana. Y entonces justamente
And we
ese
also have
panorama como
African
esa
Spanish
amplitud
collection.
de autores y de
So if we have
literatura,
such a
pues
broad
sustenta
catalog,
a esta
this
necesidad de
also
prestigio que están buscando los autores, todos los autores, porque
supports
en especial los
the
autores
need
cubanos,
for
como dice el
recognition
caso de ellos.
among Cuban authors. So how do you see? I mean, you have this technological know-how.
Siempre es un
Um,
desafío,
how do
básicamente.
you
Yo
understand,
creo que en el caso de los
Radames,
cubanos,
this connection between
viniendo de donde venimos, es casi un desafío que
editing
es industria
and
cultural.
making a
Ahí
business?
suscribo lo que
Well,
decía
of course, for
anteriormente, en el
any
sentido de
person
que
who
una
comes from
industria es la base
Cuba,
de una
creating a
cultura.
company
Dios
is
quiera que
extremely
para el
difficult.
futuro haya ministerios de cultura y recursos para la cultura, pero entender esto como
Hopefully,
un oficio y como
I
una
do hope
industria es lo
that
que
in the
también
country in
aporta
the future
más
there will
allá de...
continue to be a
Cuesta
Ministry of
poner en una balanza y
Culture,
decir,
but
no, yo
having an
solamente quiero hacer
understanding
un
of
producto
what
comercial
running a
o
business
solamente quiero hacer un
is
intelectual,
something that
etcétera,
allows you
etcétera.
to
Creo que hay un
create
punto
some
medio en todo este
balance.
proceso. Y en mi
There is a
caso,
middle
es una
point
línea
of
más, creo que más
intersection
parecida a la
between
de Verbum, una variedad de
one's
catálogos,
commercial and
pero sobre todo
intellectual
libros clásicos
interests.
escritos originalmente en castellano, con un taller muy concreto.
Since I was at
Seguimos
first interested in
publicando con
publishing
excepciones muy particulares de libros que me apasionan y por razones ya
books
muy
written
personales,
in Spanish,
libros escritos originalmente en castellano, pero no solamente libros cubanos, sino que estuviera en la currículum
not only Cuban
académicos y
books
de enseñanza. Y después, digamos, en la parte comercial, mi mayor fuerte como
from our
pequeño hombre
commercial
de
point of
negocio,
view.
como hago con esta editorial, es la tecnología, sin duda. Básicamente, el hecho de
I
que el
would
catálogo
say
está
that without
digitalizado,
a
los
doubt,
datos de base de datos
uh, the fact
verificables
that
para los
we can rely on
usuarios, permite que
technology
ustedes
has
registren un
allowed us
patrimonio
to
muy
have some
sofisticado. Es realmente el
success as a
mundo digital el que me ha
business.
dado cobertura a mí también
It's
para
really the
decir
digital
así, el
world that
aspecto
has
comercial. Y
allowed
si me
me
remito
to
un poco a
make
mi experiencia con
a
otras
bit of a
editoriales, claro, yo
profit.
trabajé en una editorial enorme,
When
con
I
una
have
capacidad
worked
de
for
distribución
other
tremenda, con equipos de marketing
publishing houses,
impresionantes y era todo
when
muy
I worked
complejo.
for
Pero
Paidos, it's
yo
a huge
allí estaba en
powerhouse
una mesa
publisher.
editando libros, o sea, no aprendí nada de eso.
I, there I was
Porque
sitting at a table
la experiencia que
editing
pude
books,
haber contado
so
de
I
haber
didn't
trabajado en
learn
Planeta y todo el
anything
aspecto
about
comercial,
the
nunca estuve en
machinery.
ningún departamento de esas
Or
editoriales
even
donde
in
se ve
Planeta
contenido
when I
comercial.
worked
Entonces he sido
a bit
como
more on the
autodidacta, pero también con la necesidad de
I
decirlo.
never
Repito,
gained
con la idea,
any
básicamente. Yo creo que
business
es una
know-how
parte de
working
nuestra
there.
misión
So
como
I'm a
editorial,
bit of
porque
a
realmente
self-taught,
creo que es común a muchos de los que estamos aquí, es crear un producto de
but I
prestigio y
think
un
that
producto con
many of
aval
us here
intelectual capaz de
have this
prestigiar a quienes
intention
sean
of
publicados,
creating
pero también de
a
sobrevivir
prestigious
como industria,
product,
porque esa es la
and we're also
garantía de que
trying
este
to
conocimiento que
survive
legamos y las
as a
personas que han
company
trabajado con
because
nosotros puedan generar
this is
industrias
how
culturales en un futuro, ¿no? Y es un poco el punto de equilibrio que creo
it
que
will
hoy
be
tenemos que
possible
encontrar.
for people that we work with to create a cultural industry in the future. Tell us a little bit about these AI tools that you have created. In fact, for several years we have been talking about this topic. you're passionate about it, and you've been working at it for several years. One time we had a conversation, and you told me that you've been hard at work and you wanted everything to get it right. I used to work at Diario de Nueva York, and we were talking about applying some of your good resources to some of our products. I think it's a fascinating idea to wonder what will happen to the platform of literature beyond the book. What will happen to literature in a world that is hypertextual and hyperconnected? This is a bit running counter to romantic thought that is focused on the book as an object. I do think that both have the right to coexist, and they will continue to coexist. This centuries-old product, the book, and then the book understood as an object, as a technological object in the metaverse. So maybe if you could briefly explain
Sí, simplificando
the resources
para
that
irme
you're working on.
mi idea con este asunto es básicamente los
To
browsers, las
put it
herramientas como el
simply,
navegador, las herramientas, los software que se usan
uh,
para leer libros
the
electrónicos,
idea is
deberían
to
estar
use
dotados ya
browsing
de
tools.
inteligencia para entender el propio contenido del texto.
They
Que nos
should
darían
be
recomendaciones y
endowed
acceso a
with an
argumentos que encajan más
intelligence that would
perfectamente
allow
con
them
nuestro
to
propio caso de vida.
understand the
No quiero hacer
content of the
comparaciones
text.
extremas, en el
That's
sentido
my
de que los
technological
grandes,
premise.
digamos, actores tecnológicos son corporaciones de una magnitud con la que uno no osa
Now,
compararse.
of
Pero, por
course,
ejemplo,
I am
pongo un ejemplo muy
working nowhere
sencillo. Si
near
uno
the
busca
scale
ahora
of big
mismo en
technological
Google la
players,
palabra
but
Barcelona,
an
Google
example, if
te va
you
a
look
buscarlo,
up
lo hace muy rápido, inmediatamente
Barcelona
va a
in
convertir lo que
Google,
por eso. Pero
it's
Google no
extremely
sabe por qué
powerful.
yo puse la palabra Barcelona en
But
esa caja de
Google
búsqueda.
doesn't know
Y
why I
dentro
am
del
looking for
contexto del
Barcelona.
material en que yo estoy
It
leyendo la
doesn't
palabra
have a
Barcelona, él hace
context
tal cosa.
of the
Ese es
material
el
in the
tipo de
context of
paradigma en que
which
creo que
I am interested in knowing the
los
meaning of that word.
emprendedores independientes tenemos aún más
So this is
en
the kind
actividad.
of
Si les parece, les voy a
paradigm that
mostrar un
we are
pequeño
trying
video,
to
es muy
develop.
breve, de una de las primeras
So
demos de esto, que la
if you
tiene
don't
casi
mind,
8
I
años,
would
y yo le he
like
dicho que en 8
to
años ya
present you a short
poco han evolucionado
demo
este
video.
proceso, pero
It's
bueno.
actually 8 years old, and that's a long
¿Estamos
time
viendo
ago in
pantalla?
technological terms.
Sí, hola. ¿Ven mi pantalla? Sí,
Do you
perfecto.
see my
Sí,
screen?
miren, esto es básicamente un video que de una de las demos que hicimos.
So this is a demo video that we made,
Básicamente aquí les explico un poco lo que está pasando con esto que hemos conseguido. Básicamente,
and I will
este es un
explain what you
documento en
see.
inglés de un libro extraído del
This
Book
is an
Experiment.
English
Y
language
como
text
verán, es un
from the
libro, se darán
Gutenberg
cuenta que es
Project.
un libro de música. El libro
You
ha
can see
sido
that it's a
procesado
music
por un
book.
algoritmo de inteligencia
It's been
artificial y el programa
processed by an
detecta cómo
AI
se puede trabajar
algorithm,
con estas tecnologías. Entonces, por ejemplo, aquí en el libro, aquí se despliegan
and I
una
want to show
serie de
you what we can
categorías.
do.
Y
So
eso
you
lo que
have
significa
access
es el
to a
algoritmo
list
ha
of
analizado los
categories.
libros y
This
ha
means that the algorithm
establecido
has analyzed
categorías
the
para
book
saber
and
qué información ese
established
libro abarca. En este
categories
caso, se
to
está refiriendo
determine
a música, en este
what is in
caso
its
en inglés.
content.
Básicamente,
So
cuando haga el
as you
siguiente avance
see,
en el video, lo que
it
van a ver es
notes
que el
that it's a music
algoritmo
book.
encuentra todos los
Then
conceptos
the
musicales de
algorithm
esta página o de este
finds
libro en
all
ese
of the
documento.
musical
Por
concepts
ejemplo,
in
está
the
hablando de un
text.
pianoforte, está hablando de la música
Here
alemana,
it
está
picks up
hablando de
the word
Wagner, está
pianoforte,
hablando de Parsifal, está
German
hablando de
music,
Gounod o de
Wagner,
Verdi.
Parsifal.
Y el campo de elementos o conceptos claves incluidos
So
en la
the
categoría
key
música,
elements
como
or
pueden ver, comprende
concepts
más de una cosa, no solamente son
included
los
in the
músicos, sino también
category
una
music, as you
variedad
see,
de
the algorithm
elementos
understands
relacionados con
that
la
this
música.
includes technical
Entonces, a
concepts,
partir
names of
de ese
composers,
conocimiento del
and many
documento,
other
empiezan a poder arrojarse resultados y
kinds of
experiencias
terms.
editoriales
And
para
so this
músicos nuevos en
yields
Internet. Básicamente,
further
hemos visto
results.
cómo detectó qué hay de música. Ahora estamos en la categoría personas y siendo un
Now we
libro
go
de
to the
música,
category
es muy probable
people.
que la mayor
Since
parte de
it's
las
a music
personas
book,
enlistadas en el libro, bueno, y
you
poco
can
sí, la
expect
gente que
most
no
of
sabe
the
del libro,
people
sean
detected
músicos.
in the
Pero
book
bueno, es un tema
to be
puramente estadístico.
musicians.
A partir
But
de
that's
saber
just a
que ese
matter of
libro contiene
statistics.
músicos, vamos a ver qué se puede obtener sobre un
Knowing
músico en
that it's a
específico
book
y les voy a
that
hacer una
speaks about
pequeña pausa.
musicians,
Lo que están
we can
viendo es un
see
estos no son
what
enlaces creados
we get
por un ser
about a
humano inventado
particular
de una búsqueda. Después los humanos trabajamos
musician.
para mejorarlo
So
y evidentemente no se
this is
puede
these
dar
are
esta
all the
lectura al
discoveries
final
of the
sin un
AI.
chequeo humano de lo que está pasando. Sin
Of
embargo,
course,
lo que ven es
humans
tal
need to
cual
check what
obtenido
the
mediante
algorithm
puro
is
esfuerzo de un
establishing,
algoritmo de inteligencia
but at
artificial.
this point, it's only
Entonces,
the AI
este era un
algorithm
grupo de
that is
músicos.
creating these
Ahora
results.
vamos a
So we
quitar
see
este
that there's a
banner
group of
y, como
musicians.
verán, él ha
Now we go
encontrado una biografía bibliografía
Richard
de Wagner. La
Wagner,
fuente puede ser
and
la
the
que más conocida,
algorithm
puede ser Wikipedia, que no está muy
finds
respetada, lo
a
admito,
bio,
pero básicamente la idea es, él puede ir a la
it can
fuente autorizada
connect
para
you
poner
to
la reseña
Wikipedia
y
or
el
a more
editor
prestigious
puede subir la
source,
información adecuada para que la reseña sea el equivalente
or
a
else
leerlo
the
en unas pocas
publisher
páginas.
can add
Entonces, en este caso,
adequate
la bibliografía de Wagner
references.
encontrada
It
en
would be
este
the
caso
modern
es
equivalent to a footnote.
a partir de ese tipo de búsqueda,
So the algorithm finds a bio
él también ha buscado la música de Wagner en tiempo real
and
y bueno, el
some
usuario
clips of Wagner's music, and this
escucha
is
la
all
música
happening
de
in
Wagner.
real time, and the user can
Como
listen to some
pueden ver,
clips.
él también analiza qué influencias
As
tuvo
you
Wagner,
see,
en qué
it
relación tuvo
also
con él.
analyzes
Entonces, en
who
este
was
caso,
influenced by Wagner. So, for example, Nietzsche.
es Nietzsche. Y aquí arriba hay una serie de categorías relacionadas
And
con el
on
término
the
Wagner
top
que
strip,
permitirían
there are some
a un
categories
conocimiento académico más
that would
profundo
allow
sobre,
you
no, no es
to
la
delve
palabra
deeper
adecuada, pero bueno,
into
se podría
Wagner.
buscar la influencia de Wagner en el cine, en los
You
medios,
could
su
look
música,
up
etcétera,
his
o videos
influence in
relacionados con él.
film, media, or find
Y en
videos
última parte del proceso,
on YouTube. The last stage of the process.
Nosotros pensábamos que esta podía ser realmente una herramienta esencial, digamos,
So we
para
were saying that this could be a
investigadores que
fundamental
estuvieran
tool
escribiendo
for people who are, for
digamos,
example, researching,
una antología crítica
uh,
o un análisis
writing
o
a
una
critical
especie de
anthology,
investigación
or
crítica sobre una obra
people
determinada que
who are
pudieran analizar el
carrying out
contexto.
a
O sea
critical
que esta
inquiry into
herramienta
a particular work, allowing them to
artificial, de
examine
inteligencia artificial,
the
ayudaba al
context.
investigador a poner en
So
contexto
it's
esta
an
obra de una manera
AI
mucho más
intelligence that
poderosa de lo
can
que
allow
un
researchers to
investigador actualmente
contextualize
requiere una
the
edición
work
crítica
beyond the
o lo que fuera.
means of
Esto,
an
digamos,
individual
personas
human
editoriales
researcher.
podría ayudar mucho a hacer ediciones en
This
contexto
could
de
be
obras de
very
1800 y pico,
helpful for
1800 y
publishers
pico, lo
to
que sea,
create
porque todo
contextualized
esto
editions
podría quedar
of
más,
older
todo esto
works from the
de una
18th
manera
century,
mucho
for
más razonable,
example,
de una manera mucho más
because you
completa,
could
y
bring in
quizás
the
solo individuos sin
context
asistencia de
in a
inteligencia
much
artificial
more
sí pueden realizar
complete way
una
than
edición crítica,
a
que a veces
lone
sabemos que las grandes
researcher.
ediciones críticas han tardado 20
We know
años,
that great
10, 15
critical
años
editions
los investigadores
sometimes take 20
en
years to make,
quererla,
while people carry out the
digamos,
research
lista para imprimir.
required
sí, es tal cual. Hemos
to prepare
diseñado
them.
o hemos intentado diseñar
It's
interfaces
exactly as
que
you
permitan
say.
hacer
We
búsquedas
have
o
tried to
investigaciones
create
más
an
allá de la capacidad
interface
humana,
that
de la
allows
limitación del
you
ser
to
humano.
carry out
Al
research
final siempre
beyond
repetiré lo
the
mismo,
capacity
es
of an
el ser
individual
humano quien
human
decide
being.
qué hace con esto y
Of
cómo
course,
queda el producto
it
final,
always
porque
takes a
eso
human
finalmente va
being
por
to
ahí.
decide
Pero en
what
este
use to
caso
make
específico, claro, él
of
hace una
these
búsqueda de
resources.
Richard Wagner
But
y
in this
puede ser
particular case, the
algo muy
algorithm,
concreto, si es una palabra puede ser adjetivo, sustantivo, plural o
you
singular,
know,
y todas las
here it's
formas van a
Wagner,
expresar
but it could
determinadas
be doing a
características
similar research
que tú normalmente
protocol
no
on the
puedes
basis
buscar
of
así.
an
Entonces, por
adjective
ejemplo,
or any
y
individual
termina
term.
mostrándonos un libro, otro libro cualquiera de la propia Gutenberg Project,
And then it
poemas
offers us
sumamente
access to
populares
another
que hacen
books from
alusión
the
a
Gutenberg
Richard Wagner.
project
Esto es un caso
where you
específico
can
de la
continue
herramienta.
to
Como
investigate the
pueden ver, esta herramienta
particular
tiene
subject.
literalmente, aquí estaba la fecha de edición, tiene literalmente 8 años.
As
Actualmente
you can
estamos
see,
trabajando, seré breve, no quiero
this is
saltar
a
puntos
demo
porque
from 8 years
sé que
ago.
hay mucho que hacer, pero les muestro rápidamente una más avanzada de lo mismo. Y básicamente
Currently, we are
estamos
working on
trabajando
a more
con,
advanced version of this.
perdónenme, está acá. Miren, ahora que ya que todos somos todos cubanos, básicamente la idea con esto
Since
es,
we're all Cuban,
estamos analizando todos los documentos legales que la
our
editorial
current
Maleza
idea
ha
is
editado a lo largo
we
de
are
20 años de
analyzing a
constitucionalismo en
trove
Latinoamérica.
of
Las
legal
ediciones que siguen
documents
categorías.
about
Las
constitutionalism in Latin
constitucionales, las
America,
emancipatorias y las
national
proclamaciones de independencia.
constitutions
Y en
in
concreto
Latin
queremos
America,
analizar
proclamations of
los conceptos
independence,
de
and
etnicidad,
specifically, we want
extranjería,
to
nacionalidad
analyze the
y las
concepts
políticas
of
migratorias.
happiness,
Si uno fuera a
of
buscar
foreign
dentro de estos
citizens,
documentos estas palabras claves que he dicho yo,
migration
tendría que apuntar
policies.
la lista de palabras y ir
If
documento por
you
documento
were
buscándolo. La idea con esto es
individually
extraer
working
dentro
through
del
all of these
documento esos términos
documents
claves
in order
y
to
encontrar en
see
qué
how
lugar
they deal with
aparecen
these
para tener
concepts,
acceso
it would take
inmediato
a
a
long
cualquiera
time.
de ellos, ya sea en
We are
este mismo
developing a
documento
tool
o en
that
todos los
allows you
documentos de la serie.
immediate access
Uno
to
de ellos es
how,
una especie de
for example,
filtro
the
inicial
concept
que
of
consiste en darle las
citizenship
palabras claves
is
que
treated
refuercen
in
para darle
different
la
constitutions
investigación
in
y a
this
partir de
case.
ahí y las interacciones que tenga
So
uno con el
you give the
algoritmo, él
algorithm
sugiere
some
otras palabras relacionadas con
entries
la investigación.
that,
Entonces mañana
on
yo
the
puedo
basis
decir,
of which
mira,
it
les
can
invento,
suggest
no
further
estamos
terms
interesados en
to
esas
continue
políticas que
your
mencioné,
research.
nos interesa la nacionalidad, la naturalización, la ciudadanía
Tomorrow, I
y
could
las
tell the
políticas de la política
algorithm, no,
fiscal.
I'm not interested
Puede
in
ser que
your
por algún instinto
suggestions.
política
Now I
fiscal
want to
yo empezara
research
a
tax
analizar
policy,
los textos
and you
constitucionales
start to feed
a
it
partir de las políticas
entries
fiscales.
regarding
Este
tax
caso concreto
policies, and it will start to offer further suggestions. So right now we have text from Cuba's 1940 Constitution, and you can relate it. It's a transmedia experience because it doesn't need to be only textual material. I think that it could be a kind of hypertext, and I could be able to connect all of my books through key concepts and add video. You could have a personal filter to determine among which videos there is a selection, and then you can have tools to store the information. So that's a synthetic overview of the research paradigm that I am developing. Since we're all publishers, the idea is that an editorial team would use a metadata system using our guidelines and include the notes from their own critical edition within the system. So it would not be Wikipedia, it would be edited content that feeds this hypertext in a conversation between humans and machines so that humans can be better informed. Basically, I say that internet allows anyone access to information, but you don't have a unique virtual shelf. Often I get an email. You might say that you have seen similar resources to those that I am developing, but it might have been scattered, an email, a browser tab, an email. So how do you retrieve, how do you store and consolidate this information? So we are trying to create tools that allow you to collect, compile, preserve the information that you come across and find useful. And again, of course, we're trying to establish a business and provide some services. For example, we can try to can be used to discover cases of plagiarism. But the basic premise is for there to be a tool that can understand the content. Understanding here is in quotation marks. That the AI can, in a sense, understand the document in a way that we can then proceed to verify. It's incredible because you're creating a business opportunity through a product developed to contribute to your activities as a publisher, because you're also continuing to release an amazing catalog of authors. So you are working as a traditional editor, but we see that you are also very creative uh, as a business person, and you're trying to create products that may allow you to fund your other activities, and you're also in a way trying to revolutionize the industry. I feel very optimistic. I'm fascinated whenever I have a conversation with you and you explain the process. I really believe that it is a viable project and that you might revolutionize the industry. One remark, of course, reading books is what allows me to analyze the algorithm, the results that the algorithm yields. I mean, I read books, the books that I publish.
Vamos a seguir por acá y quiero preguntarles a ustedes por acá, ¿qué piensan que debe
So I would
tener un buen
now
editor y una
like
buena
to
editora?
ask you two who
O
are
sea, ¿cuáles
present,
son las
what do you
condiciones,
think it
aparte
takes
de los
for
temas que ustedes han trabajado
a
con
good
muchos
editor and a good publishing
proyectos
house?
editoriales, han
I mean, for many
seleccionado
years
autores
you've
para las
worked on
colecciones. ¿Qué consideran,
various
conocen
publishing
otros editores
projects, you've
que tienen
selected
referencias
books for your
editoriales de grandes
collections,
editores a través
you know of other
de la
publishers
historia?
and editors.
¿Cuáles son estas condiciones? Las que debe tener un buen
What
editor y
conditions
las que
do you
debe
think
tener
are
una buena
required
editorial.
for there
¿Qué
to be a
consideran
good
ustedes?
editor and a good
¿Qué parámetros
publisher?
consideran que debe seguir?
What guidelines do you think should be followed?
Una pregunta que se las trae, ¿no? Se las trae un poco porque
It's just a tricky question,
sí, el
huh? Because
concepto de aquí hemos estado hablando, por ejemplo,
here we've been
proyectos
talking
diferentes, alternativas
about
diferentes, búsquedas
different
diferentes
projects,
y
different
trazos diferentes.
alternatives, different
Y
quests,
precisamente
and
esa
they
es
are
válida
all valid.
porque van cubriendo espacios que
And
precisamente
they're
va
valid
abordando lo que existe allá,
because
¿no? Y entonces el concepto de editor, el paradigma del editor,
so
pues
the
puede
concept
ser
of
muy distinto
an
en base
editor
a distintas propuestas,
can be
intereses
very
que
different
tengan
depending
y
on
cómo
what
funcione
you
el
aim to
negocio,
do and your
entre comillas,
interests,
de
and how
ese
the
proyecto editorial.
business, in quotation
Entendido,
marks, might
toda empresa
function.
editorial es una empresa,
Of course, all
como lo hemos
publishers
venido
are
hablando aquí, y
companies,
entonces
as we have
yo tengo
been
mucha
saying here.
experiencia, o sea, en Cuba,
So I
ya
have
lo mencionaba, o sea, aparte de los proyectos independientes que siempre
in Cuba,
estuvimos
in
procurando
addition
porque
to
existieran,
our
trabajé durante mucho
independent
tiempo en
projects,
editoriales de
I
vanguardia, ¿no?
worked
En Cuba,
for many years
y
in
haciendo
state
libros y con todas
publishing
las
houses and
limitaciones que tenía, pero
producing
también con
books
todos los
with
desafíos
many
que implicaba, ¿no?
limitations, but also confronting
Y
many
eran circunstancias
challenges.
muy diferentes. Pienso
And
que un
it was under
editor
very different circumstances.
tiene que tener
So I
una
think that an
formación básica
editor needs
en el
to
sentido de que
have some
también
basic
en este
training,
mundo cambiante en el que estamos, en el que está
since
siempre
we're
inmenso el
also,
editorial y está siempre
the
inmensa
world
la
is
empresa editorial,
changing,
hay cuestiones que son muy fijas, que se
but
mantienen, o
some
sea,
things
el
remain.
concepto del libro, la estructura, la institución del
Concept of
libro
the book,
en
the structure,
cuanto
the
al
institution
cuidado de
of the
la
book,
presentación de esa obra
when you're
literaria.
talking
Muchas
about
personas que se
carefully
acercan al
presenting
mundo
a work
editorial,
of literature, many
o sea,
people who get
sin
started
mucha
in the
experiencia,
publishing world and they're
piensan
unexperienced,
que
they
pasar
might
de la
think
obra
that
literaria, del texto inédito a la obra impresa
from the
publicada,
unpublished
es
work to the
puro
printed
trámite, ¿no?
work
O sea, es
is
hacer
just
o
a
sea,
matter
he
of,
tenido lectores así que me han dicho, bueno, ya lo tienes todo, ya es muy fácil, ya, ¿no? Vale.
I mean, sometimes they think that
O sea,
because they wrote the book,
sí.
it's the basic
Incluso
work is
creen que te
done.
ayudan porque te dan un
And
Word
they even
donde le
think
han dado un tamaño
they're
más o menos
helping
parecido
you
al
out
libro,
because
un
they
corte
are
de imagen
sort of,
por aquí, creen que te están ayudando, al contrario, cuando
they
casi
think that
siempre
because they chose
pues
a certain font,
algo
they're
así,
already doing
pues
your
se hace
work
más
for you.
difícil. Es como que te
So
llenan
you have to
de
explain
maleza
to
y
them that it's
tienes
a
que
bit
limpiar
harder.
mucho más para poder. Entonces,
Sometimes when they try to
el
do your
concepto
work
del
for you, then you
editor
have
va a
to
darle
undo
forma
what they have done to clean up the
a
text.
un objeto, va a crear un objeto
So I think
cultural a
that
partir de una
the
obra literaria.
concept of the
Tienes que
editor
entender,
is
tienes
a
que
person
dialogar con
who
ese
creates
autor,
a
cuál es la
cultural work
propuesta
on the basis
que
of a
ha hecho
literary
y qué
work. So
quiere,
you need to
qué está
understand the
manejando ese
author,
autor.
what
Entonces tú
they
convertir
have
eso en un
done, what they
objeto
want,
que llegue al
and then you
lector
need to
de manera
transform it into
entendible con
an
los códigos de
object
edición.
that can
No sé,
reach
es algo tan
a
sencillo
reader
como qué
in
se
a
hace con las
comprehensible
cursiva. Las
way
cursiva no
under
son,
the
o sea, la
codes
cursiva no es
of
para hacer todo lo
editing.
que uno quiera, ¿no?
For
Porque el
example,
lector
what do
puede
you
ser
do with italics?
libre,
Well, you
muy
don't
libre a
use
partir del
italics
desconocimiento
as you
de
wish.
determinados
Some
códigos
authors maybe are
tipográficos
unaware
y
of
demás para jugar, ¿no?
typographic and
Pero
other
entonces tiene que
codes.
venir el editor y un poco
Maybe
entender,
they
intelectual
sometimes
tu
are
juego,
playful,
qué
but
es lo que
then
tú
an
quieres
editor
decir
needs
con
to
estos códigos que
understand,
tú estás
okay,
jugando.
what's your game?
Entonces ahí
How are you
como
using these
crea una
codes?
economía
And
visual,
then to create a
tipográfica,
visual typographic
cultural,
economy, a
para llevar
cultural
eso
economy,
a un objeto que sea
to produce a book,
perfectamente
an object
entendible, asimilable,
that
consumible
can be
por un lector estándar,
comprehensible
más allá
by a
fuera
standard
que
reader,
existe y existirá fuera de la cabeza por muy
something that
imaginativa que
will
sea
exist
de ese escritor.
beyond the
Entonces
head of
pienso
the author.
eso obliga a la editora a tener una formación
So I
profesional.
think that this
O sea,
compels
a veces
editors to
pensamos que
go
por uno
through a
ser escritor o
professional
tener una
training.
experiencia como
Sometimes
escritor
you think that if
o
you're a
o
writer, you
respetar
have some
mucho la
experience
literatura, ¿no? A
writing,
partir de
or
los
you
clásicos
love
y
literature.
expresar en la literatura, pues ya está capacitado para ser un editor.
Sometimes you
O sea,
think
yo
that
pienso que
that's all it
a
takes to
partir
be an editor or
a
a
partir de toda
publisher,
esa formación que puede haber como lector, como escritor, el editor
because
impone una cierta disciplina
but an editor
profesional, ¿no?
brings a discipline, a
Es
professional
decir, hay
discipline
cosas que
to
hay
all
que
of
darlas
that,
por sentadas, que tenemos que
so
darlas
that
por
they can
sentadas,
say,
y entonces vamos a
we are
trabajar
going
con
to take
distintos
these
niveles de
things
códigos
for
de
granted, and
mensajes,
we
¿no?
are going to work with
Y,
different
y
degrees of
entonces
coding.
esa disciplina se adquiere sobre la formación,
And this is a
se adquiere
discipline
sobre la
that
formación
you
constante porque
acquire
todo
through
está cambiando.
training,
O sea, en este momento, por ejemplo, en
and
Ediciones
you
del
need to
Linde, una de las cosas que
continue
nos ha
to
tomado
go through
muchísimo
training
tiempo
because things are
es
changing.
elaborar un
For
producto del
instance,
libro impreso,
it has taken
pero que ese
us a
producto
long
también que
time
vaya
now
reflejado el
in our
resultado
own
final
project.
de la labor editorial
We need to create a
se
printed
cree
book
paralelamente, o sea, al mismo tiempo
that
estemos
is
creando el
works
libro
in
electrónico
parallel
y los estemos
with an
creando
ebook.
con una serie de plantillas, con una serie de códigos
So we want to use some
distributos
guidelines and
certificados
codes
de
that
libre
are
impreso para
shared
todo libro
in
electrónico
the
sea
printed
óptimo
book
para el
and
autor.
the ebook.
Pero eso tiene necesidades muy particulares. O sea, el libro
And this
electrónico, para que
has specific
funcione,
requirements.
es un
An
libro
ebook
adaptable a todo tipo de dispositivo. O sea, que
can
podamos
only function
apuntar, por
in
ejemplo, que no
different
sea un
kinds
libro
of
solo un libro
devices.
electrónico
Right,
que
our
funcione en un
paradigm is that
dispositivo
an
específico, porque va
ebook
a ser
will not
limitado,
just work in
no solo para
one
el Kindle.
particular kind of device,
O,
right? We don't want to produce a
exacto,
Kindle book.
muchas editoriales
Many
promueven la venta,
publishers,
por ejemplo, de un libro
for
electrónico, entre
instance,
comillas,
put
que es
up
más que
an
un
ebook for
PDF, es una
sale, but
maquetación
it's not
fina,
really an ebook, it's
que
a PDF.
limita por
And this
completo la lectura
limits,
de ese
completely
libro, la comprensión de ese
limits
libro. O sea, ese libro no se va a
possibilities
leer
for
bien en un
reading and
móvil, no se
understanding
va a
the book.
leer bien en una
It's not
tablet,
going
no se
to
va a
read
leer,
well
por supuesto, muchísimo más, se va a
on
leer
a
en
cell
Kindle.
phone, on a
E
tablet.
incluso nosotros, yo
You
como
cannot
editor,
read it at
nos vemos
all
obligados,
in a
ejemplo,
Kindle.
Liliana y yo,
So,
este
as
tiempo
a
que hemos fundado
publisher,
Ediciones Deslinde, nos ha tomado muchísimo tiempo. Todavía
it's
siento que estoy
taken
en la
us
parte de
at
concepción,
Deslinde
estamos
a
echando
long
pedazos
time,
muchísimas
and I
cosas,
still think
que es
that I
crear, por
am
ejemplo, un flujo de trabajo
building this to
óptimo
creating a workflow,
profesionalmente
an
para el cual tú
optimized
puedas decir, a
workflow,
ver, voy a trabajar con
professional
unos
workflow
determinados estilos de párrafo
that
o
allows
unos
us to say,
determinados
okay,
estilos de
I
carácter
will have
que van a
certain
funcionar
paragraph
tanto para
styles,
la maquetación fina
certain
como para el libro
font
electrónico y para
styles,
lograr este
which will
resultado
function
óptimo de los
just
dos.
as well in a print book
Eso
and
nos
in
ha
an
obligado, por
ebook
ejemplo, a
on
empezar,
different
o
devices.
sea, a partir ya de medio camino andado, a darnos cuenta que chocamos mucho con los autores
So along
para
the
hacer esto
way, we
accesible a sus
realized
lectores.
that
Decimos,
we
bueno,
are
mira,
always getting
tenemos que
into conflict with
partir
the
de seguir las
authors to
normas
allow them
editoriales
to
de nuestra
understand
editorial,
some of these
bien
issues.
fundamentadas, bien escritas, donde
So
sea una referencia que
we
empezamos por
realized
poner un
that we
ejemplo.
needed to
Yo
have
representando un
some
original, mira,
editorial guidelines
nosotros
well
trabajamos con estas
defined that
normas
we could
editoriales,
give
que
to
no
the
son
author.
prescriptivas, que no son
And we could tell
arbitrarias,
them, if
que
you want
forman
to turn
parte
in a
de
manuscript, you need
una buena
to use
edición, hablando
this
del
style
book.
guide.
Y entonces
And
eso nos llevó mucho tiempo, por ejemplo,
the guide
elaborar
was
esas
not
normas,
made at random,
de estilos propias de Deslinde
right?
y
So
crear
we've
un flujo de
created
trabajo técnico
our style
para
guide
asegurar que
and a
si vamos a
technical
trabajar
workflow that allows us to
vamos a hacerlo con
say,
InDesign, pero a partir de
okay, we're going
InDesign
to
va a ser
use
un solo flujo de
InDesign,
trabajo que va a ir de Word a
but we are
InDesign
going
a
to
Corel,
create
que
a
vamos a
single
convertirlo
workflow
en un
going
ebook, en
from
un libro
Word to
electrónico,
InDesign to
que
Corel.
lo vamos a poder exportar para
And then
imprimirlo, pero también como libro
we will
electrónico,
have
y
an
que va a ser
ebook
óptimo,
and
que
we will be
ese
able to
resultado
export for
después se va a
printing.
poder comercializar como libro electrónico y se va a leer bien en un
And,
Kindle, se va a leer bien en todos lados. Entonces,
and it will be a good product on all supports. It's important to talk of all these technical concerns, but the point of my question was a bit more about how do you visualize yourself as an editor and how do you visualize the publishing house that you would like to have. It's always a business and a work in progress because we as individuals are works in progress. But the question was, what kind of an editor do I want to become? What kind of a publishing house do I wish my publishing house to become? As I was saying, sometimes there are many random circumstances. Some people start out publishers because they want to they're poets and they want to publish one of their books. So there are many possible paths to follow, but usually you don't start out with a business plan as other kinds of companies do, a coherently established business plan. My question was, what are the components? How do I, as an editor, envision what would be the right way for me to proceed? And how do I envision my publishing house? Because maybe when I visualize it, I could sort of bring it closer to
bueno,
an
por ahí hay una
ideal
cosa,
publishing
no quiero
house
hablar
that I
mucho
would
más de
like
esto,
to
pero o
create.
sea, yo soy un poco
I
idealista
don't
en
want
ese
to
sentido. O sea,
talk
yo
much
pienso
more
que la
about it, but
responsabilidad
I am
como editor,
actually
como
not very
profesional, como
idealistic in
empresario que
this
tienes
regard.
dentro de
I
esto
think that
es
my
lograr el éxito y
responsibility
la sustentabilidad de tu proyecto. O sea,
is
y para eso tienes que
for your
entender el
project
fenómeno de
to
editorial, el fenómeno del
succeed
comercio,
and to be
el fenómeno de la
sustainable.
economía,
So
qué
this
está
means that
pasando
you
dentro
need
del
to
mercado,
understand
cómo está
trade
cambiando, qué alternativas
and the
reales tienes,
market,
porque no tienes nada. O sea,
what real
estás cifrado
alternatives
con
there
gente que
are.
pueda lamentarte, dice esto, yo he querido hacer la cosa más
It's
linda
no
del mundo,
use
soy
for
el
you
mejor
to
editor del
then,
mundo, pero esto no funciona, la
lament
gente no quiere
yourself saying, I
leerlo.
wanted to do the
Pues
most
no, o
beautiful thing in
sea,
the
ahí es
world,
otra
but
vez
it doesn't
parque,
work
como
because
decimos, ¿no?
people
Porque,
don't buy it.
o sea, tienes que
I mean,
entender qué
come
está
on, go
pasando,
cry in the
tienes que
park, as we
adaptarte,
say in
tienes que
Cuba, because
interpretar,
you
tienes que
need
aprender
to
lo que está pasando,
understand
adaptarte,
what's
cambiar y
happening around
forzar
you
como
and adapt.
riguroso en ese sentido. Ese es mi punto de vista. O sea, ahí
That's my
o sea,
viewpoint.
mi
So
búsqueda va en ese sentido, ¿entiendes?
that's the
Entonces,
direction of
yo
my
como escritor,
search.
idealistamente,
I,
utópicamente, hay
as
muchos
a
títulos que
writer,
tengo en mi mente,
idealistically,
las imágenes de los grandes
I
editores,
in
Rafael,
my
por ejemplo,
mind,
en un tiempo
I
escribía
think of
a
these
veces con un
great
pedazo de papel al
publishers,
día, ese diálogo, no sé cuántas cosas. El mundo ha cambiado. No hay tiempo para
but the world has
tanto,
changed,
tanto
and
tiempo.
there's no time,
Entonces, o
not
sea,
enough
prescindo
time. So
de esa cierta utopía, ¿no?
I kind of
Como escritor y como editor.
renounce
Y
these
entonces pienso que una
utopias
de las
as
cuestiones
a writer and
fundamentales
as an editor,
en el mundo contemporáneo en el día de hoy es presta mucha atención a lo que está
and I
pasando, está
think
cambiando
that
todo.
a
El
key
fenómeno
concern
del
in the
éxito de una
contemporary
editorial
world
no, o
is
sea, mucha gente lo trata de explicar, por ejemplo,
to
lo que estamos haciendo en
be
Ediciones Deslinde,
mindful.
y
I
me
mean,
hacen
a
la pregunta
successful
rápida, ¿no?
publishing
¿Y
house,
cómo venden los
people often
libros y los
ask me,
negocios? O sea,
how do you sell
tienen
your
una
books?
imagen
How does the
lineal,
business work?
que es el típico
They have a
vendedor
linear
llamando a tu casa,
image,
tocaba la puerta, te estoy
the
vendiendo algo, me lo
typical
compras, me lo
salesman
dejas.
knocking
No.
on doors
O sea, el comercio en su
individually,
origen
house
era
by
el mundo
house.
editorial, en todo el sentido general, ha cambiado por completo. Las
But
ventas son
trade
indirectas.
has
O sea, yo te
changed
tengo que hacer
completely. Now you have
convencer
indirect
y desear
sales.
algo engañándote
I
que
need
no te
to
lo estoy
make
vendiendo. Te lo estoy
you be
regalando, te
aware
estoy
of
mostrando,
something,
estoy compartiendo contigo la
desire something
experiencia, te estoy
by
creando la
tricking you into
necesidad de ese
thinking
producto.
that
Y
I'm
para
giving
eso
something to you
tienes que
for
inventar,
free.
tienes que crear una serie de juegos
And you need to create
en el cual
games.
el editor tiene que manejar las redes sociales, tiene que
And
manejar
the editor needs
otros
to be
productos
able to handle
que son
social
paralelos,
media and
que no es su
other
unidad de producto de venta,
parallel
no la cápsula de
products. So
video,
it's not
sino
just the book, but the
el
video clip,
audio, el podcast,
audio
y los
files,
trailers, los book trailers y todas
podcasts,
estas
book
cosas. Entonces,
trailers,
a mí en
right?
ese sentido me parece que como me imagino el editor contemporáneo en este mundo hoy es
So how do I
siendo
imagine a
un
contemporary
atento a
editor?
todos estos fenómenos que a veces
Well, as
parece que
somebody
para
who
el
is
editor
very aware of
tengo que
all of
trabajar más
these
forzado.
phenomena that seem to be
Discúlpame, bro.
marginal to literature, but it's all
Sí,
connected.
bueno, a mí la singularidad
Well, in my case,
del
the
proyecto es
singularity
fundamental
of my
por mi
project,
propia
I think
experiencia como
that's
artista,
very
es decir,
important
cómo tú
because of my
visualizas
experiences
el
as an
producto,
artist.
antes de
You
hacerlo,
have
cómo tú quieres
a vision
verlo
of the product
y
before you
la
make it.
coherencia
You want it
también, ¿no?
to
¿Qué
look a certain
autora
way,
o
and
autor
I'm also
tú
interested
vas a
in
publicar?
coherence
¿Quién va a diseñar
in
ese
your
libro?
selection of
Para
authors,
mí,
in
por
the
supuesto,
design.
la identidad
In
visual es
my case, of
fundamental
course, visual
y
identity
eso un
is
poco
very
también
important.
aprovecho para responder la pregunta anterior que
And
hacía el colega. Yo todavía no he
also, by
conseguido,
the way,
digamos,
responding
encontrar
to
un
the
modelo de
previous
mercado
question,
de cómo
I myself have
funciona la
not been
maleza.
able to find a
Por
market
ejemplo, por
model
solo mencionar
for La
un
Maleza.
ejemplo, existe
Just
esta
an
tirada por
example.
demanda tipo Amazon, pero esa
When you
tiene
print by demand,
como unas
as in
medidas
Amazon,
estándar y estos, por ejemplo, son
you
libros que
have
se hacen
standard
con una
measures.
medida
But
muy
for
específica
example,
que obviamente no
our
está dentro
books
de ese catálogo de
have a
medidas.
very particular
Y hasta
measures that
ahora
do not fall within those
es un proyecto
pre-established
casi que
options.
netamente cultural.
Is there a particular length?
No, no,
For
no.
example, do you only publish
Son muy
short books?
similares, exacto, sí. No, en este caso
Because usually the
coincidieron,
books you
digamos, más
put
o menos
out are
por
about
casualidad,
100
sí. Y
pages.
bueno, quería
Well, this is
mencionar, un
by
poco, claro,
chance. These two
respondiendo a
books
esa
are short.
pregunta de que es un proyecto
But
fundamentalmente cultural, es un
I
proyecto
would
que se ha
say, in
desarrollado hasta la
response to your
fecha
previous question, that
gracias
La
a que
Maleza is
estos dos libros
basically a
han
cultural
sido
project,
publicados gracias a una beca de
funded so
INSTAR.
far
Este es como un
uh,
second round
via
entre La Maleza
grants.
y
Actually, these two books
INSTAR, una
are
segunda
funded by a
oportunidad
grant from INSTAR. This is the second time.
del Centro de Desarrollo de Artes Visuales, sí.
And the first book
Y
was published
entonces,
with a grant from the Centro de Desarrollo de Artes Visuales. It's funny, this kind of poetic justice, because that grant
sí,
that
sí,
grant from an
que por
Cuban
cierto,
institution was used to
ahora
publish a
recuerdo una
book
cosa que
that
comentaste ahorita y me hizo
was banned
recordar
for 10 years.
el caso de ese libro
Right.
puntual, ¿no? De Trenes van y trenes vienen,
I
como te
was
decía, es un
thinking
libro que
about
estuvo 10 años
that book,
engavetado
Trenes
y
van y
que
trenes
tú
vienen,
te
because it
referías a
was
esto de lo de que hay
shelved
que
for
ganar el
10
certamen
years.
literario. En el caso de Roman
And you were
específico,
talking
Roman
about
con
these
21 años
literary
ganó un certamen
contests, and the
literario
author,
con una
Roman,
novela
at
que
21,
se
he did
llama
win a
Las
prize, a
aventuras de Pablo
contest,
Malo en la Vía Láctea. Él tenía 21
with
años y
a
ganó
novel called
el
Las
premio de
Aventuras de
novela
Pablo y
Dador
Palo en la Vía
y
Láctea. So he won
estuvo
the
5
Dador
años
Novel
esperando que se
Prize,
publicara
and
el libro. Cuando ya ese
he
libro salió
was
a
waiting
luz,
for 5 years
Roman
for the book to
estaba
be
en otra
published.
frecuencia, así
By the
ya
time it
no
was
encajaba
published,
dentro de
he
ese
was in
modelo
a different wavelength.
editorial
He no
cubano,
longer
ya era
fit
como un
within
personaje
the Cuban publishing model. He had become a kind of outsider character. He was no longer interested, and he also preferred not to turn in the second novel because sometimes it's not enough to win a prize. Sometimes you get into this everlasting line, and by the time your book is actually printed, you're somewhere else in your life. So, in terms of the market, I of course want La Maleza to function, but for instance, some of these books have been designed to be printed using a specific technology, which is risograph printing. And for instance, I would like to be in control of how the books are printed because I'm interested in how they function as objects and visually. So, to find a way to sustain the project under those terms, considering also that it's a young project and that I really function within the visual arts, this means that it's really a cultural project. It circulates rather through galleries and museums. And this is maybe a joy because writers are not used to have their work be in a museum rather than in a bookstore. Luckily, the work has traveled and been exhibited in many places, and this is how these weeds have been growing. I wouldn't say that you are inexperienced. I say that you are experienced. You're experienced as an artist, and this is different from the experience that somebody has working in literature. But I really like that your experience as an artist allow you to have an to focus on detail. I think that graphic design, the premise is that God is in the details or the devil is in the details. If you're not attentive to details, a book might be clumsy. And so I think, excuse me, right, God lives in the cracks. Yes, Julian Gold's work as a designer is crucial. La Maleza's work cannot be imagined without him. He's an amazing designer. He works for the Barbican Center, for the Tate Gallery. He designed the identity for the Edvard Munch Museum in Oslo, and now he's in charge of the graphic design department of London's Science Museum. So we've been friends for years, and I love his work, and La Maleza could not be possible without his work. What about you, Felipe Pio? What are your thoughts?
Bueno, yo te podría decir que siempre he pensado que
Well, I
la
could tell you that I
clave
have always
de una casa editorial es la bibliografía
understood
de todo editor. Y lo más importante para mí de un editor,
the
de
most
una casa
important
editorial,
thing in a
son las
publisher or
portadas.
a publishing house is the
Sin los
catalog,
autores,
the authors.
Betania no sería
If
nada.
you don't have authors, without
Es
its authors,
reconocido
Betania would amount to
la
nothing.
labor de,
And in that
de
sense,
gente
I
que
have
se han
always
acercado a Betania,
acknowledged
nosotros
the
nos hemos
work of
acercado a
the
ellos,
authors who have approached us or whom we have
yo creo que
approached.
es muy importante porque en el
I
fondo
think that it's extremely
los editores
important
seremos
because
recordados, ¿no? Quedaremos por ahí en una paginita, pero en el fondo quienes van
ultimately,
a quedar son
maybe editors
los
will
autores
be a
mismos y sus
footnote,
obras por encima
but people
de
will
los
remember
editores.
the
Y yo
authors
creo que hay que
and
darle
their works
relevancia
beyond the name of the
y
publisher.
importancia a la
So
labor de los
I think
autores
that we need to
en el
emphasize the
caso de Betania,
importance
que
of
es una
their
editorial
work.
obviamente que se fundó en España,
Of course,
hispanoamericana en ese sentido,
Betania
pero
was
que ha
founded in
publicado a
Spain,
muchos autores
but we
españoles y
have
hispanoamericanos,
published
latinoamericanos,
many
más de
Spanish and
200
Latin American
autores
writers,
cubanos, tanto del exilio
but
como
also more
de
than
los que la
200
mayoría,
Cuban
obviamente,
authors,
por situación geográfica del exilio y dado el momento
most of
que se
them,
hayan
of course,
publicado. En
unfortunately
ese sentido,
exiled.
creo que hay que darle relevancia a los autores de la casa editorial.
So I think that we should focus especially on the authors. I agree with you in I don't think that an editor can just be a customs agent who lets things through, or maybe who feels that it's up to them to legitimize an author or to allow an author to become a published author.
dejan de ser escritores en el empeño y ya entran a dialogar con los autores y tienen que respetar eso. Lo mismo pasa con los galeristas y con otros,
The same,
digamos,
you have the same situation with
editor en
the
realidad es un aglutinador,
gallery owners.
un
The editor
visionario
is someone
y todas las editoriales
who
como
agglutinates.
como yo le dije al principio, por lo menos es la idea mía que yo tengo, se fundan o se crean o
At
se van
least as I
desarrollando
see it,
como una
you
bolita de
create a
nieve.
publishing house
Vaya,
and
no
it
llegan a
functions
ser
as
la
a
bola de nieve
snowball.
normal, ni siquiera grande, sino que terminan
Some of
deshaciéndose.
them
Pero
don't
es una
really grow
labor
into a big ball,
cotidiana
they
y una
come
labor
apart. But
del
it's a
editor de
day by day
atraer,
task,
de aglutinar,
and
de
it's up
crear
to the
círculos,
editor to
de
attract, to agglutinate,
sumar
to
voces,
create, to add voices
eh, para el fondo editorial en el cual se trabaja.
to the catalog
Sí.
that you're creating.
¿Quieres,
Sí,
me
cómo
gustaría
no.
saber, sí, me gustaría saber tu visión
Pio,
sobre
do
esto.
you have something to add? I would like
Coincido
to know what you think.
con Felipe y con
I
Radamés
agree with
en que
Felipe and
efectivamente el prestigio
Radames.
de una editorial
Indeed,
son sus autores. El prestigio de
I
una
think the
editorial son sus
prestige
autores
of a
y tiene
publisher
que estar
lies
atento
in
Virgilio.
its
Sí
authors.
creo que
I do
es
think
como un
that
portero, ¿no? Como en el caso del fútbol.
you are
Es decir,
kind of
tiene que
like a
estar atento a lo
goalkeeper.
que publica y sí tiene que
You
ejercer
need to pay attention to what you
una
publish,
función de
and you
selector. Tiene que ser
do
un
need
selector
to
capaz de
select,
seleccionar y no que sea una aduana, sino que
but
sencillamente
not
tiene
as
que
a
tener criterio.
customs
Yo creo que ese es otro de los
uh,
elementos, es otra de las
agent.
palabras
It
clave,
just means that
el
you need to
criterio.
have a
Tener
criterion.
un
I think
criterio editorial
criterion is a
flexible,
keyword.
amplio.
Your criterion as an editor needs to be
Desde
flexible,
que yo
broad.
comencé a idear
Since I
Verbum, siempre tuve
first
como
conceived
referencia a los editores
Verbum, I
republicanos
always
españoles que viajaron
was
y se
thinking
instalaron en
about
Latinoamérica.
the
Allí
Spanish
fundaron grandes
Republican
editoriales,
editors
de
who
grandes
went
otras cosas.
to
Y
Latin America and
todos
created
fueron
amazing
con la idea
publishing houses.
de llevar consigo su
Their
producto
idea
literario, que
was
era
to
hispano, pero al mismo tiempo tuvieron la
bring
habilidad y la
their
flexibilidad de incorporarlo
project
a lo
from Spain,
americano.
but
Es decir,
they
eso
were
no
able
pasa en
to
Chicago,
be
como nos pasa a
flexible
todos
and
nosotros,
bring in
que lleva a
the
cuesta
Latin American.
la mochila
So we are
de
editors, and we have this,
obra
we're
cubana de los
carrying
autores
this
cubanos, pero que están
backpack in our
juntos también
case
a
filled with
esa
the work of
nueva
Cuban
realidad que
authors,
ahorita, que es el
but
caso
we are
de
also mindful to
reproduce
our
la
new
lengua popular y eso
realities.
es muy, muy importante, tener esa
In my
flexibilidad
particular
y
case, Spain. And so
esa
it's
apertura.
very
Así que
important
por una
to be
parte,
flexible and open.
vocación y por otra, algo que
So on
no
the
se
one
debe
hand,
desdeñar. Tantos
we
años
should
viviendo
also
bajo
not
un régimen
neglect,
totalitario,
after
como se ha
so
dicho,
many
a
years
veces se hace
living
presente
under a
la
totalitarian
comercialización
regime,
del libro, la parte
sometimes
comercial es un
you
poco
might think
desdeñable, que bueno, es de mal
that
gusto, está bien hablar, no, es muy
marketing a book,
importante
the
si
commercial
uno
part
quiere
is uninteresting
tener una
or in bad
continuidad en un
taste,
proyecto
but not at all. It's
de
extremely
escritor,
important
es ser
if you want to
consciente
have
del factor
continuity
comercial, tiene
and
que
for
estar
your
atento a
project to
ello. Y
develop
para
into
ello
the
está la
future, you
flexibilidad, como
need to
decía,
be
nosotros
mindful of the
incluimos en el
market.
catálogo una serie
This
de
is why we are
colecciones
flexible and we include in our
económicamente
catalog
rentables y que
collections that
hacían un servicio
make a
también a la
profit
sociedad
and that also provide a
educativa
service
con los textos que
to the
publicaban, pero al mismo
pedagogical
tiempo nos
society.
permitían acoger
And
otros libros
they
que no tenían
also allowed us to
el
publish
talón
other
que
books
podía tener esto. Es decir, la
that maybe
comercialización es
would
muy
not sell
importante si
as
se quiere
much.
tener un criterio de
So
continuidad y
being
de
aware of the
futuro en
market
una
is
editorial.
very
Y por
important if you
supuesto,
want to have
el
continuity.
criterio, los valores
And of
con los
course,
que
you need to
uno
have
quiere
a
publicar
criterion, you need to have
edificios, criterios
values
de calidad,
by
criterios de
which you
estética,
judge
criterios
your their.
no censura, no
It's
censura.
about quality and aesthetics.
No creo en la
I
censura. Por
don't
ejemplo,
mean
si me
at
permite
all
extenderme un
censorship.
momento,
Sí, por supuesto.
If I
nosotros
may speak a bit
publicamos
further,
el año pasado un libro del
last
hijo
year we
de
published
Fulgencio
a book
Batista. ¿Eh?
by the
El
son of
hijo,
Fulgencio
hijo de
Batista,
Roberto Batista, el que
Roberto
publicó
Batista.
sus memorias en su relación con su
He
padre.
published
A mí
his
me pareció
memoirs about his
apasionante, me pareció muy
relationship to his
interesante,
father.
porque este
I thought
muchacho
that
había
it was
escribido toda su vida,
extremely
cuando
exciting.
publicó el libro tenía
This young
63
boy
años y estaba
suffered
jubilado
his
en ese
entire
momento
life.
en
He published the
Nueva York.
book at 62.
Había
He
caminado
retired
toda su vida con
from
el
being a lawyer
príncipe
in New
herida,
York.
de
But
donde
his
quiera que
entire life,
apareciese,
he had
era
carried the horrible
señalado como el
burden
hijo del
of
dictador,
being
el hijo del
pointed
asesino,
out
el
as the
hijo de la
son of a
bestia.
dictator,
Y
the
vivía
son of a murderer, the
era
son of
muy
the
inteligente
beast.
también, que efectivamente su
And
padre había
well, he
cometido
was a
errores. Su
smart
padre
man. he knew that his
el
father
disparate del golpe de Estado. Y ese libro, que está lleno de
had
lecturas y
done
al mismo tiempo de
insane
análisis
things.
de la vida
And
política de su
this
padre,
is a very
a mí
tender book
me
and an
gustó
analysis of
y
his
es una
father's
recomendación que
political life, and I
pensaba que
liked
lo
it.
había hablado con
And
algunos otros editores
he
y que
told me
me
that he had
parecía que,
discussed
bueno,
publishing it with other
esta
publishers
figura
and
que
that
sacó un libro que de alguna manera
he
veía a Batista como una persona, como un ser humano, como un tal. Bueno,
he
a mí me pareció que eso era precisamente lo más atractivo, lo más atrayente de
they
la
would
poesía, no la
accept the idea of
necesidad
a book
de
that
tener una visión
depicted
abierta y
Batista as a
flexible
human being,
a
but
lo
I
que está
thought that that
llevando
was
a la
exactly
mesa
the
del
point.
lector.
So this is an
De
example of
acuerdo
how I think
totalmente
that
contigo.
there is
Y
no
hay algo
role
que
for
decías sobre
censorship
el
in
éxito
considering
comercial que me
what you
parece
might publish.
extremadamente importante que
Something you said
editores
about
independientes lo
commercial
tengan en cuenta.
success,
Y yo creo
I
que el
think is really
éxito
important.
económico para el cubano es la mayor de las
Financial
subversiones.
success for Cubans is the
Durante
most
muchísimos
subversive
años
thing
nos han
because for many
hecho
years
creer que el
we
dinero
have been
es
led to
dañino,
believe
que el
that
dinero
money is harmful,
empaña cualquier empeño artístico
that
y
money
que el
taints
éxito
any
económico está
artistic
asociado a
endeavor,
la
and
decadencia de una
that
ideología
financial success is
o
linked
incluso a
to
la
a
miseria y la
decadent
pobreza de otros.
ideology
Es como
and even
si la
to the
riqueza estuviera en una
poverty of
especie de
others,
balanza mental
as
para
if
estos
wealth
individuos
were
totalmente
in a
obtusos
mental
que piensan que una
balance
gente
for
se
these
enrico
completely
a costa de la
narrow-minded
pobreza de los demás.
individuals.
Es como si
So they
es
think
como
that
si el dinero,
it's only possible
el
for
dinero y la
some
riqueza
people
fueran
to be
finitas
rich at the
y entonces nada
expense
más
of the
pudiera
poverty of
existir ese tipo de
others, as
balance. Yo te
though
quito y por
wealth
eso
were
tengo.
finite,
Cuando
and
realmente la
so
riqueza ya
some could
sabemos
only have more
puede
if others
generar
have
riqueza y
less.
los países
But
producen
we actually
riqueza que
know
no
that
tiene que
you
estar
can generate
asociada
wealth, and
digamos, a
countries
bienes
produce
que son
wealth, and this is not
totalmente
connected
finitos o que
to
son
finite goods.
o sea, la riqueza y el bienestar dependen de una cantidad de factores que
So
no
wealth
entran
and
dentro de esa
welfare depend on
ecuación
many
tan oscura
factors
y
that do
cerrada,
not
que es
fit
la de que unos se
within
enriquecen a
such a
costa de
close
otros y que porque unos
equation
sean ricos,
according
otros
to
tienen que
which
ser
some
pobres.
people get
Y
rich
yo
at
creo
the
que eso es muy
expense of
importante porque yo
others,
creo que eso es lo primero que
and that the
uno,
wealth of
cuando sale al
some
mundo
entails
libre,
the
tiene que
poverty
aprender
of
a
others.
lidiar
This is important. The
con
first
este
thing that you
asunto de
need
que el dinero
to
no es
deal
malo,
with
el
when
dinero hay
you
dos
go out
bandos, el
to the
dinero,
free world, when you
y
understand
no es
that
ni
money
siquiera de
isn't
que
bad.
los medios respondan a ciertos fines o lo que fuera, es que simplemente el
It's
dinero
not even a
es
matter of
actividad de
that
mercado.
the
No hay ningún
means
tipo de
fit the
moralidad en
ends,
torno a
but
ella. O
money
sea,
is just
lo
a unit
usamos,
of
somos
exchange,
nosotros
and
los
there
que
is
podemos
no
usarlo
particular
para un
reality
fin
around it.
positivo
We
o para
use
un
it,
fin
we
malvado.
can
Eso
use
es
it
que es tan
for
simple
a
como eso.
positive
Y realmente ese es
goal
uno de
or
los
for an
grandes
evil
prejuicios. Yo
goal,
creo que
and
al
that's
final el
all. And
éxito
this is an incredible
económico de
prejudice. And
cualquier
I
cubano,
think
artista y empresario
ultimately,
es la
when
mayor
any Cuban, an artist,
subversión
or a
del
business
que un gobierno
person
que ha intentado que todo el
succeeds
mundo
in
sea
the
pobre
market, this is the
de esa
greatest
dignidad.
act of subversion against the government that has tried
Súmate,
for
Ricardo, con esta última
everyone
pregunta
to
antes de
be
despedirnos y cuéntame
poor.
un poco qué tú piensas. ¿Ah?
Bueno, a grosso
Sí,
modo
sí.
coincido con todos lo que han dicho.
Well, I
Solamente
roughly
agregaría
agree
algo
with
que
what
ustedes deben
everyone else
considerar conmigo,
has
que también
said.
hay que aprender a decir que no.
I
Porque
would
Sí,
add, and you
eso
will
es una
agree with
cosa
me,
que
that
querer siempre
you really
demostrarse
have
y
to know how
una
to say
luchadura y
no.
crear comunidad
You
y
will
muchas
always
cosas,
have
pero hay
many
una enorme cantidad
proposals,
de no que vamos diciendo
but you
sistemáticamente
really have to say
a
no a
autores,
whole lot.
incluso a autores que uno aprecia. No solamente hablo ya de
Even
alguien en
to
Vieja que sé que
authors
ya es totalmente,
you appreciate,
digamos, fuera de lugar,
some,
sino incluso que quizás
sometimes
leer un libro, apreciarlo y decirme, yo no soy
it's
tu
not just
editor,
crazy manuscripts,
incluso
but it's
por ya
happened
hablar un
to
poco de
me.
la parte comercial, porque mis canales, mi ímpetu como
Let's say,
editor y mi capacidad para olfatear a
talking
dónde
about
puedo ponerlo, no da para ese
trade,
libro. También me ha pasado así.
sometimes I realize that my
Que
channels
es un poco una
through
parte del
which I can
proceso. No, lo
sell a
último que
book,
quería decir también es
I am
que
aware that I
creo que
cannot
los
sell the
trabajos,
particular book even though
como
I
casi
think it's
todos los
good.
trabajos contemporáneos, nos imponen, en mi opinión,
I think
aprender
that
cómo han cambiado los hábitos de consumo en los últimos
editing
30
in
años de la humanidad.
contemporary
Es
terms,
decir,
as in other
Internet, cómo se hace
forms of
marketing y todo,
employment,
entre
they
comillas,
compel us to
tenemos
understand how
herramientas
things have
digitales o no
changed. So we
digitales
need to
para hacer
understand the
marketing,
internet,
boletinas, comunicación.
forms of
Es toda
marketing,
una pléyade de
digital
cosas que
tools, and other kinds of tools. It's a
tenemos que saber
panoply of
dominar,
things
tener gente que
that
la domine de
we,
cerca. Creo que también forma parte de
if
lo que
we
uno
can't
necesita como
control them
editor, ¿no? Yo
ourselves,
en resumen
we
es
need to
saber
hire people
discernir
who do.
y entender cómo la gente consume
So I would
cultura o
say
información.
there's these
Son
two things. You need to
cosas
know
que
how to say
cambian.
no and to understand how people
Vamos a hacer
are
algunas
currently
preguntas
consume
del público
culture
que hay
and
acá presente
information.
y entonces, si ustedes tienen
Well,
la
let's now
generosidad de
take some
contestarles,
questions from the audience, if you would be kind
Bueno,
enough
muchas
to
gracias por la
answer.
presentación. Hemos aprendido por lo menos bastante y uno
Thank you for your presentation. We have learned so much, and it's an honor to be talking to people who have so many years of experience and from so many different generations. One question: I have heard you often talk about publishing houses in exile. We were talking about independent publishers. Of course, many of these projects can only come true when people go into exile. But do you know of a journal or publishing projects that have attempted to publish literature or thought, critical thought in Cuba? I mean, I remember there was the journal Aguilar, the Diáspora, Convivencia, Vitral. Well, of course, Vitral had support from the church, but it was independent because the director was Dagoberto, although then he had to shut it down and he created Convivencia. Right, but so I wanted to know, how do you envision such possible experiences within Cuba?
Bueno, si ustedes quieren responder
Sí,
acá.
quería comentar algo muy concreto,
Well, I
¿no? Nos
wanted to
pasó,
respond to
nosotros, bueno,
something
publicamos Trenes Van y Trenes
very
Vienen estando en
specific.
Cuba
We
y
published
además de
Trenes
tener
Van
que
y Trenes
lidiar con
Vienen
todas las
when I
dificultades
was in
que hemos
Cuba.
hablado,
And
la
in addition
persecución
to all of
política y
the
tal,
difficulties
a
that
nosotros nos
we've
pasó que
discussed, political
en ese momento
persecution,
existía solo
etc.,
un negocio
what
privado de
happened at the time
impresiones
is that
y
there was
enviamos
only
el
one
libro
private
a
printer
imprimirlo. Es decir, el
in
libro había
Cuba.
sido
We sent
diseñado
the book
para
to be
imprimirse en
printed there.
risografía,
I
eso
mean,
fue
it was
imposible.
designed to be
Y cuando
printed in a
llegamos a
risograph
imprimir, la impresión fue un
press,
desastre.
and that
El
was
libro se
impossible. And when we
deshizo, luego yo
tried
viajé
to
a
print it, it
España
was
y
a
tuve que
mess.
hacer
The book came
volverlo a
apart. I
imprimir.
traveled to Spain and I
Y
had
eso
to
fue
print
como,
it
uf,
again.
qué difícil, ¿no? Qué difícil porque
And
además las
so
condiciones
it was,
prácticas se te hacen
it
muy
was just,
difíciles
it's
y
so
realmente
hard
muy
because the
desagradable.
even simple practical things
Además de
are
toda la
very
cuestión
difficult
política,
and
¿no?
it's very
También la cuestión
discouraging.
a nivel
In
práctico, bueno,
addition
cuando
to
tienes
the
un proyecto con
political
las exigencias que
obstacles,
tiene la maleza, pues
when you
realmente
have a
es muy
project
agónico
with demands
llevarlo a
like
cabo.
those of La Maleza, it's really agonizing to try to get it done there. In Cuba, there is a natural obstacle. There is no independent publishing house there. No, they don't exist. They cannot exist for legal reasons. A book can only be a book if it has an ISBN number. And this international record number can only be granted by the Cuban government. Unlike in exile, you can apply elsewhere. In Cuba, you can only get one through government institutions, not just the ISBN, but the ISSN for periodicals and journals is also awarded by the government. So this means that publications that are awarded an ISSN, if they are independent, they are, in one way or another, covered by a government institution. So most of them are published without an ISSN. So maybe the government allows them to be published because they don't have an ISSN number. So they could be shut down at any moment if the government would want to. And I think that the government uses that as a bargaining position. I have a funny example. We tried to create a journal called La Gaveta. Eventually, we put it out, but at first, we wanted it to be a kind of like a journal for theory and art. And we went out to request these numbers, and they were never awarded, and we got tired. And since we were members of the editorial board of the Editorial Provincial, we decided to transform it into a book, and we did it through that publishing house. So it says Cuadernos La Gaveta above, and then the title with an asterisks. So the false title is a footnote, but it's not a book, it's a journal. I don't know what happened afterwards. It was a bit chaotic. After 3 or 4 years, when I was no longer there, they were able to begin publishing it as a journal. I don't know if it still exists, but it was published for a few years. And we were publishing banned or shelled texts. So that book that was a kind of like a shortcut that we took to beat the system, we were able to do it at the time. We had texts by Humberto Piñera, texts that would have never been published in Cuba about the art market and many other topics. Well, that's an example. Usually, an example like that will cost many people their careers and their jobs, but you do it because you have a kamikaze spirit. That's my experience. I don't know if you all want to contribute to this question.
Joaquín, que para mí lo más importante de
Joaquin,
todo
I
esto,
think
más
that the most
allá
important thing
de los
is the human
requisitos
factor
burocráticos
beyond
de cualquier
bureaucratic
estado
requirements or
organizado, es el
I
factor
mean
humano,
any
es decir,
organized
hay
state will
una
have them,
convicción
but there is a
o
human
motivación
factor, and
suicida, llámalo
it's
como
for
tú
that
quieras,
reason that somebody who has
escribir
a conviction or
en la
a
máquina
suicidal
de escribir
passion, as you describe
7,
it,
14
somebody
copias
will sit down,
y
write
las distribuye
something,
entre los amigos.
put
Otro
out
va más
14
allá
copies
y
or
no hace
distribute
una copia,
them
hace
among their
20
friends,
copias,
or they will go
con
beyond. They make
papel
20
cartón
copies
o lo que sea. Es decir,
using
hay
carbon paper
publicaciones en
or
Cuba que se
whatever.
hacen, que
I
no
mean,
están registradas, no
people
tienen
publish
el
things in
certificado
Cuba.
de
Sure,
nacimiento,
they are not
pero que
registered, they
requieren
don't have a
un
birth
coraje,
certificate,
de una
but they
gran
take a lot of
valentía y de
courage
una
and
gran
bravery
responsabilidad moral. Yo creo que hay
and
algo
moral
que quiero ver como ser
responsibility.
humano, esa gente que lo hace,
So,
que se
what I'm interested
entusiasma,
in
que
is this
registra y
human
después
factor.
van a
The
la
people who
cárcel.
do it, they're rejected, they
Es lo que
end up in
realmente a mí
prison.
me entusiasma
And this
y me
is what
hace tener un enorme respeto por esa gente.
really excites me and makes me feel extreme respect for those people.
Sí, yo coincido con Pío y creo que habría que
I
recordar
agree with Pio.
que
We should
realmente
remember
cueste que existan editoriales o revistas
it might
independientes, librerías
be
independientes, pero sí existieron
difficult for there to be
sí,
independent publishers or
editoriales y
journals, but
revistas
they have existed.
artesanales fuera del circuito de
There
Cuba.
are
Por ejemplo,
handmade
recuerdo
journals, for example,
justo
produced beyond the
mencionaron
reach of
a
the
las
state.
ediciones Vigía de Matanza del amigo
I
Alfredo Saldívar.
remember, for
Estos
example,
muchachos publicaron
Ediciones
en el, no me
Vieja
acuerdo
from
si fue año
Matanzas,
90 o por ahí,
I think around
un,
1990,
eh, una antología de poemas de Gastón
we
Vaquero de una
published
forma
an
artesanal,
anthology of
totalmente
poetry by
artesanal.
Gaston
Era papel de
Vaquero.
cartucho
This was made using
con hilo de, vamos,
craft paper
exacto.
and,
Y
bound
tenía
with
todos los poemas
threads from
la
a
tapa estaba
sack,
pegadita así
and the
con goma
covers were glued,
dentro de una caja de
with
tabaco.
inside a
Entonces,
tobacco box.
a Gastón le mandaron 3 o 4 cajas,
Gaston
3 o
was
4
sent 3 or
antologías,
4
estaban en la caja, cada una en una caja y le regaló
anthologies
una. Y yo creo
in
que
one of
es
these boxes,
editorial
and he gave me
Alfredo
one.
Saldívar y
So
ediciones
Alfredo
Vigía,
Saldila
y
did
muchas,
this,
muchas más
and I think
que
that there are
hubiesen
many
podido
other
publicar
examples, as Pio says,
interesantes
of
y muy
many other
valientes,
publishers who
muy
have
valientes.
carried out a tireless and extremely brave work. Right, some of these projects are more independent than others. Maybe we can place independent in quotation marks. For example, Torre de Letras did have a bit of funding from the government. They and Vigia, for example, was connected to Centro del Libro, although Alfredo has always been very selective and published authors who live outside of Cuba. Right now, in the Tate Gallery, I'm sorry, in the London's National Library, there is an exhibition of documents and books, etc. And I was struck to see a book by Nance Morejon, produced by Ediciones Vigia. It's beautiful. You could fold it out, and they were exhibiting it alongside first editions and book treasures. And they had this book by Ediciones Vigia. It's one of these books that they produce that are kind of like with collage on the covers and
Vigía, por
bound with
ejemplo, llegó a
thread.
publicar a otros autores exiliados.
Vigia even
Me refiero a
published
la
other exiled
peruana María
authors.
Elena Blanco,
Maria Elena
a
Blanco, the Cuban poet,
A José Coser,
Coser, son
and
varios.
Jose Coser,
Como Vigía hay
several of them. And there are others like
Quiero
Vigia.
comentarte, o sea, la experiencia que uno tiene dentro de Cuba, siempre ha existido la voluntad del Estado de que no haya nada independiente
I
siempre ha
mean, this
existido
idea
la
in
voluntad de los
Cuba
intelectuales
that
de
there
hacer
is
algo
nothing independent,
medianamente independiente hasta donde
there
se
has
pueda,
always been a will
hacia
among
frente a
intellectuals
esa
to do
circunstancia.
something
Y
at
siempre ha
least
existido
partly
una
independent
contrarrespuesta del Estado de tratar
when this
de
is
tomar
possible.
esos
And
proyectos
the state has
independientes,
always responded by
ampararlos,
attempting to
modificarlos como
seize
un
those
buen
projects,
mecanismo de control,
support them,
¿no? Y
but
terminar
also
controlándolos, porque de
modify
hecho
them as
terminan
a way of
controlándolos,
controlling them.
aunque no
And
nos guste muchas veces.
actually,
O sea,
they
porque
do end up
realmente esa
controlling them, even if
tontería
we
de
don't
bajar
like
el
to.
totalitarismo es
So
real.
when
O
the
sea, llega un momento en
totalitarian
que ellos te
regime
dicen, tú
allows
existe
you
porque
to
te estoy
live,
perdonando la vida. O sea, el día de mañana
sure,
si
at
yo
some
quisiera
point
no
they
existir,
say you
la prueba es
exist
real.
because I
Y
am
hay gente que
pardoning
dejan de
you.
existir
And if I
porque
did
claro
not
que dejan
want
de
you
existir de
to
la noche a la
exist,
mañana.
you would not. And it does happen. Some projects just suddenly disappear. You have situations where
Yo
a book can be ready to
Lo
print
que
and
pasa es
then
que
there's no
también, o
paper
sea,
to print
es
it
todo
on.
muy simbólico porque el mecanismo
Right,
de
of course, it's
realización, entre comillas,
quite
de un
symbolic
proyecto
because
editorial,
the
entonces como que uno lo va
mechanism
moviendo también jugando
by
con eso.
which you
Por ejemplo,
produce a
Diáspora es un
publishing
magnífico
project
ejemplo.
requires you
Diáspora existe como una construcción cultural más
to
allá
play.
de las factualidades y
Diaspora is
expresiones
an
que llaman
example.
ellos
It's a cultural
científicas,
construction
pero ellos como
that
grupo
goes far
intelectual tan
beyond
sólido,
what
tan
they actually
inteligente,
published. They
fundamentados
didn't
también
publish
en
that
eso,
much,
crear un trabajo que
but they
sostenido a lo largo del
created
tiempo,
such a
que el Diáspora
solid base of
existe
work
con
and so
todas
well
las letras,
argued
más
that
allá y mejor
Diaspora
y de manera más
exists
concreta que todo lo que se haya publicado en los años 80 en Cuba por las principales editoriales. Y existe para la crítica, existe
and it
para los
exists
lectores
in the
y
eyes
existe
of
también en las bibliotecas, ¿no?
critics
Los
and
resúmenes que se han
readers
hecho,
and in the
las publicaciones
libraries.
que se han hecho. O sea, hay una voluntad intelectual, hubo una voluntad
So there
intelectual de
was
responder
an
a eso
intellectual
de esa
will
manera.
to
Bueno, ya
respond
aquí
to
se
that.
mencionó, yo pensaba mencionar las ediciones de Reina María Rodríguez, por ejemplo, un
You
magnífico ejemplo de
already
personas que
mentioned
se le dan cierta permisibilidad, o sea,
what
hagan
Reina Maria
proyectos
Rodriguez has
independientes
published.
y yo no les
She has
respeto,
some
también les respeto
leeway
porque son independientes, hacen lo que pueden y lo pueden hacer con dignidad, ¿entiendes?
and they
Aprovechando
do it with
las
their own
circunstancias.
means.
De misma
And I think that
manera,
this is
pueden existir
extremely
proyectos
legitimate. They do
supuestamente
what they
independientes,
can.
entre
Of
comillas, que
course,
están
some,
amparados por
some
una
projects
asociación de
are
hermanos ahí, por aquí,
nominally
por allá, pero uno como sabe cómo funcionan las
independent,
cosas dentro de Cuba,
but
detrás de
since
eso
you
hay
know
una
how things
seguridad
work
del
in
Estado
Cuba,
todo el tiempo
you know
haciendo
that state
inventario
security is behind and
día
they
por
are
día
keeping
haciendo
a record
inventario, quién se publica, qué están
day
haciendo,
by
dónde se
day
presentan, con
who is
quién se
being
juntan,
published, what
qué
they are
hacen
doing,
allí, decidiendo
whom
dónde
who are they
compran
meeting.
por aquí o por allá.
Uh,
Pero gracias a Dios vamos a van a seguir
so
existiendo cosas
thank God
y se van a ir imponiendo
independent projects
más
will
allá
continue to pop up
de lo que
and
disponga el gobierno.
I was talking to Tanya and we remembered that some
Sí,
people
estaba pensando en
were given
Reinaldo
the
González, por
opportunity
ejemplo,
to run their
después de la
own
polémica de
journals,
los
right? Like Reinaldo
emails, por
González.
ejemplo, una forma de premiar a
After
determinadas personas por su
the
tipo de
whole
participación cultural,
Duhimel
que es
polemics,
decirle, te va a
they
pagar
would
porque crear
reward
tu
people who
revista,
had
el otro tiene su centro por allá y le
participated
permitimos su revista, le damos,
in the
o sea,
polemics in a certain
sí,
way.
yo
They
por
were
aquí siempre
allowed
quería irme
to
antes y
run a
mencionar
center
ediciones
or
como,
to
por
have
ejemplo,
a magazine.
de Camagüey,
I also
el grupo
wanted
Magno,
to mention
porque
the
es una de las
Magno group
alternativas también a las
in
posibilidades. O sea, ¿qué es lo
Camagüey.
que no hay en
This is
Cuba? No puede
another
haber una
alternative.
imprenta, no puede haber una
What
imprenta
don't we
independiente
have in Cuba?
de
Well, you cannot
impresión,
have
un mecanismo de
an
impresión
independent
que sea
printing
independiente.
house, a
Ahí se va a tirar
printing
la policía
machine.
política y se va a llevar los
If you
editores,
have
porque eso lo
that,
sabemos que ellos
the
no están
political police
exigiendo
will
eso.
come and take away
¿Qué es lo que
the
sí hay?
machines.
Y soy testigo de
We
eso.
know that there's no
Gente que
way
se pone de
around
acuerdo
that.
con el que trabaja en la risográfica,
But
va de madrugada
what
y
do
se
you
quedan
have?
en
Well,
los cuadernillos, se
people
sacan, no sé cosas y
who
se distribuyen.
talk to someone who
Son
works at a
gente que
printer
imprimen
and finds
afuera,
a
como
way to
Ediciones de
print
Magno, por
something,
ejemplo, un grupo intelectual
or
con
people who
una,
print abroad, like
exacto,
Ediciones
que es un grupo
o Magno.
que Rafael
It's
Almanza
a
como
group of
cabeza principal está en
intellectuals
Camagüey, toda la gente que lo
led
rodea
by
a él,
Rafael
parte ya del
Almanza
grupo
in
de
Camagüey.
solidaridad con gente que están fuera de Cuba, imprimen sus libros, tienen su
They are
editorial,
in
su
solidarity with people
catálogo
who
en
are
internet, es
outside
una
of
editorial
Cuba.
independiente que
They
su
print
base está en
their
Cuba,
books. It's an
porque esta
independent
gente que están afuera,
publisher
sobre todo están
located
volcados
in
a la
Cuba
solidaridad con
because
quienes están en Cuba, que más necesitan publicar
they are being
hoy
assisted with
y la
people who are
impresión
abroad,
y los ayudan a
and so
soportar estos proyectos y la
they
distribución
fund
de los
the
libros y
printing
demás. O
and the
sea,
projects and they help with
sigue existiendo el
distribution.
mecanismo. Son
So
editoriales
there
que no
are
están en Cuba.
still
Aquí quiero
ways to
tocar
do
otro
it.
tema que es muy importante. O sea,
You mentioned
entre los
something that is
complejos que
very
nos
important
llegaron a
just
crear el mundo
now.
intelectual
One
cubano
of the
era que para todo
complexes
tiene que
created
existir un
among
plano
Cuban
central.
intellectuals else. you're told that you need to have a central canon for everything. And if that shifts a little, we are scared. We are scared of atomization. We need to have a central vertical column that legitimizes everything, like the publishing house Letras Cubana with their incredible prices. I remember for many years I participated in the poetry meetings in Santo Espiritu. You feel embarrassed now that we spent so much time discussing the danger of atomization. We would be saying, oh no, too many things are being published. Now we cannot tell who is important and who is not. What about the hierarchies if anyone can publish a book now? So independent publishers and all of these projects, at this point, Cuban writers and intellectuals don't care if the book is not published in Letras Cubanas or won such and such a prize. It's good enough if the project, if it's published by an independent publisher, if it's available on the internet, and people have confidence that their literature can stand the test of time. It was very difficult for this to happen if you have nothing, if the books are just shelved and sometimes you wouldn't know if they exist or not. It was hard to stand the test of time with those scant resources. But now there are projects that make this possible. I think it's interesting to think that you can have a publishing house in Cuba that manages to get around censorship by printing the text outside of Cuba. I think that this is all entirely legitimate. And of course, it's the same with the independent press. It's produced in Cuba. Yesterday, we were talking about Giovanni's blog. For many years, she was producing it in Cuba and she would send it abroad and people would print it abroad. This would otherwise it would have been impossible to maintain a platform daily from Cuba. Nowadays, we have the case of 14 y medio. It's an open window to Cuba, and there are people who contribute from Cuba. And people can get it in Cuba, even though it's made in Spain, but it's directed at Cuba. And perhaps the most, it's maybe the best example is Ediciones del Puente, José Mario's Ediciones del Puente. This was really a landmark. They published about 30 books from men, women, white people, black people, gay people, straight people, and it was a complete scandal. And this was the origin of El Caimán Barbudo as a response. Most of the people behind that went into exile, even Jose Mario. I think we should remember them because El Puente was the first attempt, and they were taking advantage of the fact that there was a printmaker who had a small machine at home, the kind that was used to, and they used those to print those books. Yes, when I started to say there are no printing machines in Cuba, and then I remembered, but I didn't want to confuse the argument. But indeed, after El Puente, they tried to, which is it, there was an attempt to institutionalize it and swallow it up, and then it shut down. But since then, it's been almost impossible to produce independent books, to produce books independently in Cuba. After the 1990s, people had access to risograph printers, a bit better than photocopiers, but you don't have risograph printers everywhere. The government controls them. But some churches, for example, there was a bit of a honeymoon between the church and the state when the Pope was about to visit. Some churches were allowed to have these machines, and this is how we started putting out Vitral. We made it by hand, and sometimes you feel even nostalgic because we're doing it all ourselves. We used glue, we uh, a church official got us a machine to glue the spines because we used to do it by hand. And for many years, whenever I would uh, create a kind of like a dummy or a mock-up, I continued to bind the books by hand to fold and then we had access to a machine that made hard spines and we produced uh, pretty odd books, but they were all handmade. And of course, we gave out literary prizes and all that. But I mean, this kind of process, it is independent, but it's not autonomous because you are protected by an institution. And this means that the state will not be able to pound you because you're undercover. But I would say that if someone would try to do this in their own house independently, they will be in prison the day after. So it's complex. But yes, it's very good for you to remind us of Ediciones El Puente. They really pioneered and revolutionized many things. We could use the word revolution in its true meaning. It's a it was a truly inclusive space. I mean, I'm saying we need to contextualize words properly. For many years, we understand progress in such a counter revolutionary way. We're no longer able to use words with their true meaning. Revolution is to create progress and to lead to somewhere. I don't know if someone else has a question. If not, then I would like to thank you for joining us in the second of this series of talk in this series. We will now move on to discuss other independent projects, journals. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I think that we've all learned a lot. We can also get a sense of friendship among us. I think that many of these publishing houses have made room for authors from the provinces because Cuban culture is really tends to be centered in Havana. But in this case, many of you come from the provinces, and others have allowed the talent from the provinces to put out their work. So I wish those of you who are in Germany a good night and bye
Oh,
bye, everyone. Thank you.
encantado. Saludos, Francis. Saludos, Pío. A Lester
Joaquín,
también.
Joaquín, 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 solo una cosa más. Primero agradecerte a ti que hayas abierto este espacio de
Joaquin,
diálogo
one more thing.
entre
I
nosotros.
want to
Agradecerle a cada uno de los
thank you
editores
for
que han
creating
estado
this
con nosotros,
space of dialogue for us,
sobre
and
todo
I want to
porque
thank
su
all of the
experiencia
other
como
editors,
organizado, su experiencia
especially
editorial,
those of you
son
who
un
are
estímulo, son un
just
estímulo para los
getting started.
viejos editores
You
que
even
vemos
inspire
que la mejora
older
nuestra tiene una
editors
continuidad
and
y una continuidad
publishers because
efectiva y
we
además
see
con un
that our
espíritu
work
muy
has a
saludable.
continuity.
Lo que ha hablado
So this was
Maleza
extremely encouraging
a
to
mí me ha
me.
entusiasmado mucho y me parece que esa idea,
Everything you said
esa provocación
really
casi
inspired me and excited
ahogado
me. It's a kind of a
de la experiencia que
provocation.
está teniendo, me parece que son fascinantes y concebida además como un servicio para otras editoriales es
Also
multiplicadora
because
y es realmente
if
ha sido
what you
gratísimo
were talking
poder haber
about,
compartido
Rado,
con
you've
los amigos
conceived
que han
something,
estado
a
con
tool that
nosotros y
can
sobre
even be
todo agradecerte
used
a ti
as a
que nos
tool
hayas dado este
by
espacio de
other
diálogo
publishers.
tan
So these are all extremely exciting
importante.
possibilities. This was a great dialogue. Thank you, Pio. Bye.
Sí.